Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We are going through The Fountainhead. We are on part 2. This is chapter 6 through 10. Panelists today are going to be Rob, Sherri, and then we'll figure out the order after that. But we're going to start off with Rob and Sherri because they need to leave early today. So Rob.
All right, so we got a lot to cover because we were supposed to cover stuff last week, and then we did Shrikant's again, which is great, but it means we've got 10 chapters to cover here. So I got a couple things. I had to narrow this. Sherri and I both had to narrow this down, but I've got a couple things I want to go over. So one of the big things that happens in this section is we get the deep dive into the backstory and the character of Ellsworth Toohey. We really get to understand who and what he says at some point. I dare say nobody knows what I am. He says, I think Dominique says to him, I don't know what you are, essentially. And he says, I dare say nobody does. And he seems to gloat at that nobody knows what he really is. Well, we find out what he really is essentially in here.
I think his aunt knows.
Well, his aunt knows, yes.
What does she call him?
She says, you're a maggot, Elsie. Yeah. You feed on sores. He says, then I shall never go hungry. And so the thing we got to start with Ellsworth Toohey and his development is that he is sickly. And he's sickly, but he's sickly in the context of growing up in an altruist environment. So there's a great part about how his mother loved the bluer and sicker baby Ellsworth got, the more she loved him. That there was martyrdom in loving him. So she sort of ignored her older daughter, who was healthy and attractive, and it didn't take any work to love her. But precisely because he's so unworthy, because he's so blue and sickly, she loved him all the more because there was martyrdom in loving him. So this is, he grows up sort of steeped in that he grows up physically unfit and steeped in this sort of altruism of worshiping him because he's physically unfit. So that's the sort of background. And now, I think knowing what I do from Ayn Rand's viewpoint, I think the way she constructs Ellsworth Toohey is he's someone who feels that he is not capable of dealing, because of his physical unfitness, he feels he is not capable of dealing with reality himself. He's not capable of dealing with the world and being successful in the world himself. So he feels that in order to be successful, he has to do it through other people. He has to, because he uses the fact that he's actually intelligent, that he's mentally fit, he uses that to direct it to, I will then control other people. And that was what will give me control over the world. And specifically, there's a great passage here which says, he discovered that the bright, the strong, the able boys of his class felt no need of listening and felt, so let me back up a little bit. At this period, he began to acquire friends. He liked to speak of faith, and he found those who liked to listen. Only he discovered that the bright, the strong, the able boys in his class felt no need of listening, felt no need of him at all. But the suffering and ill-endowed came to him. And we got these great, Drippy Mun and Skinny Dicks, all these great nicknames. And so he, uses the suffering of other people and their need of him to manipulate them. And there's an interesting, so I'm skipping over this fairly lightly, but there's an interesting section there where he first takes on religion, and then he switches from religion to socialism. And that's a really interesting thing because, of course, this is counterintuitive even today to a lot of people that, there's the socialists on one side and there's the religious people on the other side. In all of our politics is you have the religious right versus the socialist left. And her idea that he could switch so easily from one to the other because it's really following the same goal. The idea of finding a thing he can use to manipulate people and to appeal to their sense of need and bring them under his sway. And there's the great line about how the preacher tells him, what does it profit a man to lose the whole world, but to gain the whole world, but lose his immortal soul? And so he says, so to be truly wealthy, one should collect souls. And that's the most important line you have to realize, keep in mind about Ellsworth Toohey's technique and what he does throughout the rest of the book, is he's going around collecting souls. So I'm going to talk about that again in a second. But what she really does is she makes him into the physical embodiment of altruism. Into the idea that but specifically into I talked before about how there's this concept of pathological altruism or toxic charity. And what she does is, now she, in Ayn Rand's view, those are redundancies. All altruism is pathological. That is, all orienting yourself around others and the needs of others is pathological. And TUI is really her way of showing what the pathology is. Now, in the modern view of pathological altruism, where it's like altruism gone wrong, because the modern view is altruism is good, but here's how it can go wrong. But in the modern view of pathological altruism, one of the characteristics of pathological altruism is that the person who is helping others, the altruist, the humanitarian who's going around helping others, is really more concerned with his own control of others and his own sort of, he gives help with strings attached, and it's really all about his own control of other people, and it's paternalistic. And that's exactly what's being embodied in Ellsworth Toohey, that he discovers that altruism can be used as a weapon to control other people under the guy, but while looking like you're the good guy, looking like you're the hero, because you're the martyr, you're willing to sacrifice yourself, and yet at the same time it can use as a weapon to control other people. So it's a very deep examination of the pathologies of altruism that she's offering in the person of Ellsworth Toohey. He's both a product of the pathologies of altruism. The bluer and uglier he got, the more she loved him. And he is a wielder of altruism as a weapon to collect other people's souls. And it's basically to collect other people's souls in order to fill this gap between him and reality. This fact that he doesn't feel fit to succeed and survive in reality, so he fills that gap by collecting other people's souls and controlling them. And one of the creepiest parts in this whole section that we're dealing with, so I'm going to skip way ahead, but it's a really good sort of bookend to this characterization of Peter Keating. This characterization of Ellsworth Toohey is that we have in the initial sort of biographical sketch we get of him earlier in this section. He talks about what happens when Katie arrives. His niece Katie arrives, and he sees her eyes full of hope for the future, and he decides then that he's going to take her in. And we know by now, with enough setup from Ellsworth Toohey, he's not doing it, to help her. He's doing this because he's going to collect her soul. And about, some 50 pages or so later, we have the scene. This is page 363, 364 in my version, where we see her we see him collect her soul. Mm-hmm. And that's where she comes back to him and says, she's in a state of crisis. She's been jilted by Peter. She's gone and buried herself in social work. She's in a crisis where she finds herself being bitter and angry at other people and hating the poor. And she says, why is it I set out honestly to do what I thought was right, and it's making me rotten? And then he says to her, do you really want me to tell you the answer? Because you've given the answer yourself in the things you said. She lifted her eyes blankly. What have you been talking about? What have you been complaining about? About the fact that you are unhappy, about Katie Halsey and nothing else. It was the most egotistical speech I've heard in my life. She blinked attentively like the school child disturbed by a difficult lesson. Don't you see how selfish you have been? You chose a noble career not for the good you could accomplish, but for the personal happiness you expected to find in it. But I really want to help people because you thought you'd be good and virtuous doing it. Anyway, so he says, if you're skipping ahead, if your first concern is for what you are or think or feel or haven't got, you are still a common egotist. And he says, you must stop wanting anything. You must forget how important Miss Catherine Halsey is, because you see, she isn't. Men are important only in relation to other men, in their usefulness and the service they render. Unless you understand that completely, you can expect nothing but one form of misery or another. And he goes on, he says, you have to kill the most stubborn of roots, the ego. And only when it is dead, when you care no longer, when you have lost your identity and forgotten the name of your soul, only then will you know the kind of happiness I spoke about, and the gates of spiritual grandeur will fall open before you. But Uncle Ellsworth, she whispered, when the gates fall open, who is it that's going to enter? He laughed aloud, crisply. It sounded like a laugh of appreciation. My dear, he said, I never thought you could surprise me. Then his face became earnest again. It was a smart crack, Elsie. Sorry, it was a smart crack, Katie, but you know, I hope, that it was only a smart crack. Yes, she said uncertainly. I suppose so. And so what you see here is he is taking advantage of this opportunity to go in for the kill, to tell her to destroy. He says, you have to, we must destroy the ego first, to destroy herself. And she actually catches him on the contradiction of that. But he has her so much under his thumb after years and years and years of her sort of hanging worshipfully around him, that when she comes with the perfect answer that would refute him, he doesn't have to answer it. He can just pass it off as, oh, that's just a smart crack. He doesn't notice he doesn't answer it though. He says, he pushes it aside, and she has been so under his thumb that she won't follow up on it. She won't take seriously the one thing that would refute everything he's saying. But this is the scene where he is, you see the technique, he is collecting her soul, and having told her to destroy herself, she is then there to be completely, everything that was in her that was part of her own soul is gone. She's there to completely be molded by him. So this is the essence of Ellsworth Toohey. But notice that it's all tied in with the altruist premise, and specifically the line, men are important only in relation to other men, in their usefulness and the service they render. So this goes back to the whole theme of the novel about collectivism versus altruism, collectivism versus individualism in the soul. The idea, his premise is the idea that men are important only in relation to other men. So, the idea you define completely by your relation to other people. All right. Now, there are two, that's I think the most interesting thing happens here is we find out what Ellsworth Toohey is essentially. And it's central to Ayn Rand's critique or analysis of altruism, which of course, is part of her overall theme of collectivism versus individualism. But there's a couple interesting sort of historical and literary references in here that you might pass over very quickly, but which are very interesting. So one of them is when he finally does his column on Howard Rourke, the column titled Sacrilege. It's part of the Hopton Stoddard thing. He begins it with a little snippet of poetry, or a slightly paraphrased version of poetry. And that's just, the time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of ships and shoes and Howard Rourke and cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot and whether Rourke has wings. Now, where is that from? So this is a kind of a common thing, especially back then, that columnists would do, is they take a little snippet of a well-known poem and lead from it. That is from a poem called, you don't need to keep this file. Okay. A poem called The Walrus and the Carpenter by Lewis Carroll. This is from Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There, 1872. So it's like the second of the it's a sequel to the Alice in Wonderland books. And this poem is, I'm going to read you this poem. It's deeply weird. Don't try to follow it or make sense of it all, because it was sort of a nonsense style. They literally called it nonsense poetry. There's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make any sense in it. It was sort of weird that, it's this late Victorian literary thing where like surrealism had a fad in the late Victorian era, way before Salvador Dali and all those guys in the 20th century. Surrealism came to literature. So don't try to make sense of all the little bits and pieces, but you'll get to, by the end of this, you'll see why it is that this is a really interesting thing for Toohey to be quoting from. All right, so here's the poem. The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright. And this was odd, because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily, because she thought the sun had got no business to be there after the day was done. It's very rude of him, she said, to come and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be. The sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds to fly. The walrus and the carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose, the walrus said, that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. "O oysters, come and walk with us," the walrus did beseech. "A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than 4 to give a hand to each." The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd because, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4, and thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low. And all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. "The time has come," the walrus said, "to talk of many things, of ships and of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot and whether pigs have wings." "But wait a bit," the oysters cried, "before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath and all of us are fat." "No hurry," said the carpenter. They thanked him much for that. "A loaf of bread," the walrus said, "is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar, besides, are very good indeed. Now, if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed." "But not on us," the oysters cried, turning a little blue. "After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do." "The night is fine," the walrus said. "Do you admire the view? It was so kind of you to come, and you are very nice." The carpenter said nothing but, "Cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice." "It seems a shame," the walrus said, "to play them such a trick, after we brought them out so far and made them trot so quick." The carpenter said nothing but, "The butter's spread too thick." "I weep for you," the walrus said. "I deeply sympathize." With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. "O oysters," said the carpenter, "you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again?" But answer came there none. And this was scarcely odd because they'd eaten every one. Okay, so in the context of Ellsworth quoting this in The Fountainhead, this is creepy as hell.
It is.
So you see the, yes. So one of the things in this poem that jumps out at me is this idea of total opposition. The sun shining in the middle of the night. The world turned upside down. But the main thing that jumps out is that he offers these oysters a treat, which they eagerly accept of, "Oh, we can go for a walk with you." And they all sit around waiting for him to dispense his wisdom. Time has come to talk of many things. But what's really going on is he's going to eat them all, which you would expect a walrus to do with oysters, right? That's what walruses naturally feed upon. And I particularly like this. What really gets creepy is this section here of, "I weep for you," the walrus said. "I deeply sympathize." With sobs and tears, he sorted out those of largest size. So expressing his compassion for them while he's in the process of getting ready to eat them. So in the context of Ellsworth Toohey, this is almost like a joke he's making at the expense of his audience, of saying, "I'm going to quote this poem because what I'm really doing is I'm pretending, I'm luring you in with the treat of dispensing wisdom to you, and now I'm going to eat you." It's like he's telling them that in the column, but if you don't know the poem, you're not necessarily going to get that. And that when I was reading this and seeing that in the poem, it reminded me of a section. Let's see, 255. This is very early on in this section. Yes, when we first see Toohey at Kiki Holcomb's party. And one of the sort of old dowagers who's talking to him says, "Now, of course, I've heard that you're some sort of radical, but I won't take it seriously, not one bit. How do you like that?" "I like it very much," said Toohey. So in the context of this poem about the walrus and the carpenter, you can see he likes it very much. That they all think that I won't believe you're a dangerous radical. You're so charming. Because he's getting them to come along with him and eagerly listen to him so he can eat them. So I think that's something that really adds a lot of background to this. I don't think that's in there by accident. Let's put it that way. That Ayn Rand didn't have him write that in his column by accident. She knew the poem and knew what it was referring to. Another interesting historical literary reference is to, let's see, 357. I've got some of these marked and some of them not. Here we go. In his column after Rourke loses the trial of the Stoddard Temple, he writes in his column, Mr. Rourke pulled a Frin in court and didn't get away with it. We never believed that story in the first place. All right, so what's the story of Frin? Anybody familiar with this one? Show of hands. See, I'm as somebody whose background is in classics. This is an ancient Greek story. Frin is Phryne. This is somebody. So this is sort of a legend. So if you go and research this, what you'll find is people say, "Well, we don't really know how much or how much of this is actually true." There's all these stories. It's a real person who existed in ancient Greece, but we have all these different stories and nobody really knows what's true and what's not. Many of the stories may have been embellished. But Frin was a courtesan who lived in Athens in the 4th century, basically the middle 300s BC. And she's a famously beautiful, and it says here that according to some legends, she grew up poor and became one of the wealthiest women in the Greek world. One of the fine things that's very interesting. Oh, here's where I need to do a little screen sharing. So according to one of the stories, she was the lover of one of her lovers was Praxiteles.
What do I do?
Hold on. It's keynote.
Keynote.
Yeah, but I've got it up in the wrong thing.
Oh.
Let me go back. No. I didn't want to go that one.
This one.
All the way back to the beginning.
Okay. What did I just do?
I have no idea what you just said.
Okay. Pause for technical difficulties.
Here we go.
Here we are.
We're going to go back a bit from here, though, because
I think you go up or down.
hold on. Let me just escape out of here. And I have them in the wrong order. That's the problem.
Oh.
Okay. So one of her lovers was Praxiteles, one of the great ancient Greek sculptors. And he sculpted the Aphrodite of Cnidos, which was a famous depiction of Frin as Aphrodite. So this is based on her. This is a Roman copy. The Greek original didn't survive, but there are a number of Roman copies. So this is what presumably she would have looked like. And the most famous thing about Frin, the interesting thing about this one is the first, it says here, the first three-dimensional and monumentally sized female nude in ancient Greek art. So the male nude had been a staple of ancient Greek art. The female nude had not. Females were usually clothed, even though, like, with we saw the Winged Victory, Samothrace, a couple weeks ago. She's clothed, although the clothing reveals a lot of the figure underneath. It's sort of like a wet sari scene in Bollywood. But the idea is that it was not considered respectable to portray a nude female. But if you were doing Aphrodite, you could do it. So this was like the first female nude in ancient Greek history. Now, the most famous thing, not quite yet, most famous thing about Frin, though, is that she was put on trial for impiety. Mm-hmm. So a trial for impiety. I mean, you can see the direct reference here, because that's exactly what what just happened with Rourke. He's been put on trial for impiety. Supposedly her prosecutor was a former lover, a jealous former lover. And according to the legend, her defense counsel, at the summation of his speech in her defense, pulled off her cloak and revealed her naked body, specifically her naked breasts, to the jury, and basically, used her beauty as his defense. So you can see a trial for impiety and beauty being used as a defense. So this is the reference that Ayn Rand is working on there with Frin. You can go end the screen share. Oh no, keep it on, because I'm going to go back a little bit. Oh yes, and there we go. So this is from Jean-Léon Gérôme, early 19th century French painter. This became a subject of art. There's a number of different artworks that were based on this story. So this is, her defense lawyer pulling back her cloak, revealing her nude body to the jurors, who are reacting with various different, it's an interesting range of reactions you get on their faces if you look
Like
close
this
enough.
guy here.
But so this is a popular subject of art in the 19th century, and this idea of her extreme beauty being her defense against impiety. And actually, you know, in the ancient Greek context, there's actually a plausibility to that, because it was considered sort of a function of her beauty was considered to be by some to be indicative of her being beloved of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. All right, so
Do you want me to go to the top slide?
okay, one more. Yes, go back up to the top one. And one more classical reference here is throughout this, there's the phenomenon of Dominique posing for the statue, the nude statue of a woman that's in the middle of the Stoddard Temple. I think the real life analog to this is the statue of Diana that was on top of the tower. It's called Diana of the Tower. It was on top of the tower at Madison Square Garden. This is the older version of Madison Square Garden, the original one. And it was from 1893. This is on the top of the tower from 1893 to 1925. And it was built by architect Stanford White. Now, Stanford White was a very neoclassical architecture. You can see, you know, he's sort of one of the bases for Franken and Keating is Stanford White, because you can see the classical columns down below and all that sort of thing. But he commissioned this statue from Augustus St. Gaudens, one of the great late 19th century American sculptors, of Diana, of a nude Diana with her arrow there. But you'll see there's some interesting aspects of this. One is that, the model for this, there was two different models he used, but the model for the face, yeah, go to the next one. You see many reproductions of this were done. So this is the original one was destroyed in a fire later, but there were many different copies that were made of various different sizes. This is one of them, gives you a sense of, you know, it's a very lithe, athletic figure of a beautiful woman. The model for the body was one of his regular models. The model for the face was Augustus St. Gaudens, one of his models, but who was also his mistress, and had one of his children. So a woman he clearly, you know, had a long relationship with, and that was the model for the face. Her name was Davida Johnson Clark. But the interesting thing is that when this nude statue of a woman was placed up on top of the tower in the middle of New York City, it was a scandal. It was considered scandalous. And there was a guy named Anthony Comstock, who had the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, who campaigned against the statue. And at one point, they actually agreed to put to drape her in cloth, the statue in cloth. And it was partly because she was supposed to be a weather vane and move in the wind, and it never quite worked properly. So they were hoping maybe this way she would catch enough wind. But what happened is the cloth just blew off.
Of course.
I have a feeling, though, that White and St. Gaudens knew the cloth was not going to stay on. So they did, oh, we'll put a cloth up, don't you worry. And then, of course, they knew that's not going to last.
It keeps blowing off.
Now, the interesting thing is, because the original one, which is 18 feet tall, was too heavy, they took that off and they put a smaller one on. They did a second version. And the original was sent to the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, the White City, the one that we've already heard about, the neoclassical one. And there it was supposed to be put on top of the women's pavilion, but the Women's Christian Temperance Union protested, and they insisted the nude figure had to be clothed, and so instead they put it on top of the agricultural building. But you see this idea that, you know, this how scandalous a nude statue of a woman would be. That was a common idea at the time. By the way, and this was widely parodied too. Let me just see. Okay, this is a Collier's magazine, which is a big, well-read national, says a national weekly, a well-read national magazine at the time, parodied all of this because
we have to read this because they're
yeah,
not able to
you
see
can't.
it.
I'm sure you can't read this little placard that's put on there. You see, it's Diana, and she has cloth wrapped all around her,
Down to her toes.
down to her toes. Yes, and the little sign that's hanging on her says, "Created by St. Gaudens, purified by St. Anthony Comstock." And the little figure at the bottom there
On the ladder.
on the ladder is Anthony Comstock blowing a horn. I can't read what's on the horn. The resolution isn't good enough. And he has a little like fake wire halo over his head. So this is how widely ridiculed this sort of moralizing was. Now, one last little bit
Another
about
slide?
this.
Stop share.
I think that's the, oh yeah, we're back to, okay,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
you can stop share now. The other little historical aspect of this that's interesting is that Stanford White would eventually be one of the great, it's called the trial of the century at the time. In 1906, on the rooftop theater of Madison Square Garden, the architect, Stanford White, was shot to death by a guy named Harry Thaw. It was a wealthy heir to some industrial fortune who was basically cuckoo bananas. The guy was mentally unstable, but he had married a showgirl named Evelyn Nesbit, and was apparently enraged when he discovered that Evelyn Nesbit had once been a lover of Stanford White. So he went and he shot Stanford White, and one of the reasons he gave for shooting him was he believed, inaccurately by the way, he believed that Evelyn Nesbit had been used as the model for the statue of Diana. And so he was offended that his wife had been used as in this scandalous way as the model for this nude sculpture. So you see that all of this is part of the historical background. This all happened in the 1890s and the 1900s, but all of this is part of the historical background for that she's drawing on for this idea of how scandalous it is to have this nude statue of a woman. Now, one last, two short things. One that I wanted to, because we were trying to cram so much in here, I just had to make a few quick comments about something. I want to comment on the emptiness that Peter feels at the opening of the Cosmos Slocknick building. This is the beginning of chapter 11. He tried to talk himself into the joy. He felt nothing. He had to admit that he was bored, but he smiled and shook hands and let himself be photographed. Tui watched him as he seized his drink and slumped in his seat. Wasn't it grand, said Tui. That, Peter, is the climax of what you can expect from life. I thought that's true because Peter, because Tui knows exactly how Keating actually feels, that he feels empty and can't feel any joy in this. And he says, this is the climax of what you can expect from life. And he knows exactly what he's talking about. And then the last thing is the big thing that jumped out at me that was new in this reading of the book is the extent to which it is what it is that kicks off the whole Stoddard Temple thing. And this is a conversation where between one of these conversations between Dominique and Tui. And she says, I shall try to stop any job that comes his way. I shall continue trying. It's not going to be so easy as it was, though. The Enright House, the Cord Building, and this. Not so easy for me and for you. He's beating you, Ellsworth. Ellsworth, what if we were wrong about the world, you and I? And this is huge because, this could be Dominique totally changing, revising her view of the world and changing away from this sort of, this rebellion she has against values. But of course, she can't do that because look where we are, right?
We're only halfway through the book.
Maybe a third of the way through the novel at this point. So a third of the way through the novel, she can't realize that they're wrong about the world. But what jumped out at me this time is when she says that, it's after she says that Tui comes up with the Hopton Stoddard thing. So I think this is in a way, Tui is responding to that question of, are we wrong about the world? And he's trying to come up with Hopton Stoddard case. He's trying to come up with something that will prove that they're right about the world, that will prove that somebody like Howard Rourke has no chance, that he will be destroyed by the second-handers. And when you think about it, the Stoddard Temple trial, the whole fiasco it's designed to validate every wrong premise that Dominique has about the world. So there's an earlier section there. I marked it, but I don't think I put my notes on it. No, it's much earlier, where she says to Rourke, everything I've done in my entire life is because it's the kind of world that sent you to work in that quarry. So that's her premise. This the kind of world that sent you to work in the quarry. And now he's out of the quarry. He's got the Aquitania. He's got the Cord Building. He's got this growing success. And she's starting to wonder, am I wrong about the world? And the Saturn temple should be looked at as an attempt, as basically an event that validates everything that she thought about the world, that it was the kind of world that will send him to the quarry. And specifically, what it validates, one of the details I think is not incidental, is the smutty comments that are made about the nude sculpture. So this is something that she exposes herself. I mean, the most literal way, she exposes not just her body, but her soul to the world by posing for that statue. And then, Tui, of course, it's no accident that he does this. They make sort of smutty sex jokes, these sort of sex jokes about it, in it specifically an attempt to say, you exposed your soul to the world and we're going to degrade you for it. Mm-hmm. And so that's really what breaks the back. And when she goes off to marry Peter Keating, I think she says something like, there's nothing you can do to me that I won't do to myself first. So she exposed her soul to the world. She saw it degraded, and that emphasized in her the idea that this is what the world's going to do to me. So I'm going to, rather than suffer the slow torture, there's nothing you can do to me that I won't do to myself first. And she picks the worst thing she could possibly do, which is marry Peter Keating. What struck me is how important that line, which says maybe we're wrong about the world, how important that is in moving us towards the Saturn temple as the thing that sets her back and that makes her think, no, I wasn't wrong. It validates that and sends her to a new phase of trying to, I think, before this, she's trying to destroy Rourke. Well, okay, this just appeared to me. Before this, she's trying to destroy Rourke. After this, she's trying to destroy herself. Mm-hmm. And that's what she's doing by marrying Peter. So the next phase of her development is she's trying to destroy herself. All right, so wow. I have like 5 other things, but these are the most important ones.
Rob, I should always ask you to do too much, because what you end up doing is just simply magnificent. If I wanted to summarize what you did, is that you did what the defense counsel for Friend did for us on 3 times. 3 times. The first one was the story of Friend itself. There is that reference which I had never seen. I think most of us had not seen. And you took the veil off there and you showed the beauty of the Friend reference.
The poem.
The second one was showing that that's exactly what was going on with Dominique. Mm-hmm. Dominique did exactly that, of saying, this is my argument. And it was rejected. And the ultimate culmination of that was taking the raps off Alswatuhi and showing the walrus with all these little souls marching up to him willingly to be eaten up. Beautifully put. Thank you, Rob. Sherri, you're next.
Okay, so
and now that it took all our time.
Yeah, he took a bunch of my time. So you're gonna have to, if I can get to the corpses, you're gonna have to choose between corpses.
Well, maybe we'll see how it goes.
Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about, I've got a couple little ones. And again, oh man, the pages of notes here of what I wanted to talk about. I had to cut it, or we'd be here all night. The first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to bring back this issue of color. Remember, we talked last time or the time before about this very specific orange color of Howard Rourke's hair, and this color that keeps coming up, this color in the beginning of these groups of chapters. We are introduced to Dominique at Kiki Holcomb's party, and she's wearing a dress listed as the color of glass. And so I wanted to show you the color of glass. You're gonna have to run the screen share this time. So this is it here. So most of us think of glass as clear. Go ahead. But glass actually has color. What you see here on the left-hand side is normal plate glass. We look through it every single day. We don't notice necessarily that it has this slight greenish blue tint to it. On the right here is a sample of what is called low iron glass. So if you're putting a new shower door or shower enclosure in your bathroom and you really don't like this greenish colored glass, because those shower door glasses are usually like 1/2 inch thick glass. You can buy for a markup this clearer, whiter colored glass, but that's not what we normally see. What we normally see is this on the left, this palish greenish blue color to the glass, and the thicker the glass, the more prominent that color. Now, what's really interesting is this color comes from an iron oxide, an impurity in the glass making process that makes this pale color. I love this description of Ayn Rand using this color as Dominique's dress, because she then goes and talks about the fragility of how she looks. And this is, of course, really important because we have to see Dominique in a moment of intense strength in just a few minutes' time when Howard Roark walks in the room and she realizes who he is. So we have this image of delicate glass, very fragile, very breakable, right at the same time in our minds that we're hearing about her strength. And I love that combination. But there's another combination that I really love. The color of glass comes from this iron oxide, but iron oxide is also really, really prevalent in another material, especially here in Virginia, and that is red clay, which happens to be the color of Howard Roark's hair. So I think what's really fascinating is that the exact same mineral that causes both of these colors in the same, in totally different materials and totally different forms, these are both this color because of iron oxide. So speaking of these two colors, we jump towards the end of this group of chapters and we hear about the cord building, and it's described as a tower of copper and glass. And the color of copper, of course, we all know, is this color, which is the same color as iron oxide in the soil, is the same color as Howard Roark's hair. But what's really fascinating is when copper oxidizes, it becomes this color. So we keep getting these pairings of this icy greenish blue paired with this bright orange color, and it keeps coming through over and over again. So let's stop share for a second. The other couple of details I really wanted to point out here is that we hear at the very beginning, the same scene when we see her in the dress, the color of glass, we see this dramatic scene where she suddenly finds out who it is that she met in the quarry. She finds out that it's Howard Roark, the designer of the Enright house. And this hits her like a ton of bricks, iron oxide bricks. But what I think is really, really interesting is that this is when she first connects that person with the name. And through this entire section and on to future sections for quite a ways in this book, she refers to him, notice this, in public as Mr. Roark and in private as Roark. So much so in this section, she comes at the end of this section, right before the section ending, when she comes to him after marrying Peter Keating, she comes to him and tells Roark that she loves him, but she doesn't say Howard. She says, I love you, Roark. And so that's important. She uses his last name throughout quite a long portion of that book. I'm not going to give, well, okay, there's a spoiler. At some point, she doesn't use Roark, but now that it's in your mind, pay attention. That'll be even greater when you read through that section. Now, the interesting thing is, on the flip side, Roark in private or in public, when he first meets her at Kiki's party, which is quite a scene, he very, very politely and formally calls her Miss Franken. I really prefer the way Maritza says it. Frank, I really do. It sounds so much more like her instead of, Midwestern in her cow boots or something.
Right.
Anyway, but in private, of course, he never, ever calls her that. He always calls her Dominique from the very beginning. And so when we get to that same scene where they're professing their love for one another, she says, I love you, Rourke. And he says, I love you, Dominique. And that's really, really important. Now, this is quite a shock between these two. She then, of course, as we all know, she's married Peter Keating right before this scene. And I am so entertained by this little detail. And this is that sort of cinematographic way that Ayn Rand writes. There's always a vision happening. It's not just the words. There's a whole picture that forms. So Dominique comes and proposes to Peter Keating. And when someone proposes to you, this is not how it's supposed to go. It's described as Peter sitting down heavily, like somebody just hit his dog with a car, or his great aunt or his best friend just got killed in the war. That's when you sit down heavily. You don't sit down heavily when somebody proposes to you. But of course, in this case, he has a sense of life reaction, and he really does need to sit down heavily. But we have a very similar opposite side here reaction when, after confessing her love to Howard Rourke, she goes back to consummate her relationship, her marriage to Peter Keating. And this is, trust me, not what you want to hear the night of your wedding. When everybody else finally leaves, she turns to Peter and says, all right, Peter, let's get it over with. So, I mean, I've joked with Rob that that's what I'm going to do on date nights.
All right, let's get it over
All right, let's get it over with.
And I'll sit down heavily.
And you'll sit down heavily. There we go. So we'll have it all done. That'll be good. But this is part of this contrast that she's doing all the way through the book. You see,
Peter does a lot of bad things in this book.
Oh, poor guy.
But his punishment just happened to be who he is. It's just happened to have his life.
It's bad. It's bad. But we get these contrasts. We're presented Peter Keating as the hero, as the success, but he really isn't. And we're seeing this perfect marriage, this, as Tui calls it, this aesthetic fantasy of these two married, but it isn't. And that's part of her inviting us to untangle these details. So another little detail that I love in this book is on page 322, we get the they don't call it the bows, they call it the costume ball. So we need to share a screen here.
Yeah, I'll get it.
So this is when we have this, because I like to make sure when people are reading this, these things sound so bizarre. She writes, there's this party, this costume party, where all the architects come invited, dressed in their best buildings. And I always got the impression that people who read this thought, well, how on earth do you come up with a story like this? Well, because it happened. And not only did it happen, this was one of the biggest ones. This was in 1931. And you have William Van Allen in the center here as his Chrysler building, which is, oh, come on. Who doesn't want to go to a party dressed like that?
I want that hat.
You want that, but you got to duck to get through every doorway. But these parties continue throughout architecture. They're never quite as grand as they were in 1931. But even when I was in architecture school, there was parties and balls where it's architects' version of Halloween, where you come dressed as a building. And I remember there was some discussion among my first year architecture classmates and I. We thought, we're in the pre-architecture program, we should come as pre-architecture. So we came up with this plan that we would go together as Stonehenge. But then we got too busy on our project and we never finished the design or the costume. But anyway, one of the other really interesting details about this particular lineup of architects in their buildings is take a note, which here, just to, I guess that would be your right, just to the right of the Chrysler building. This is Elie Jacques Kahn dressed as the Squibb building.
That's not squid with a B, but squib with a B.
And this is the building that we're talking about. Now, what's interesting about this is when Ayn Rand was doing her research for The Fountainhead, she worked in Elie Kahn's office. So my guess is there must have been a picture from that infamous, hilarious, highly successful party of Elie Jacques Kahn dressed as his own building and all the others. So this is that connection, that real connection that we have there. Then we have, let's see, I'm trying to get this quick. We're gonna okay, Rob, you're gonna have to choose.
Okay.
We're either gonna talk about the temple or we're gonna talk about the corpses.
Talk about the temples if we have time.
Okay. So we're one of the things I wanted to talk about was
always temples over corpses.
Yes, temples over corpses. And I wanted to bring this one up because we're talking about temples, and Rupali has brought the pictures of this Lotus temple in India before, and it is such a beautiful building that I thought we should start with this for what is going to come. Because not only is it just a beautiful building, this is one of the best photographs I've ever seen of this building. But what I wanted to talk about here was what is the temple that they're looking for in this description. So we have first the idea of the reason that Stoddard was going to build this temple to begin with, and we know it's essentially like religious penitence. He's trying to pay off his sins in creating this temple. So we hear his reasons for it here on page 315. Stoddard found relief in religion, and it's described here in the form of a bribe. Now, this is not Stoddard finding enlightenment in the temple or peace or joy, relief. So that's an important part. Toohey hears this, and then he goes further. Now I'm going to jump forward to parts later on during Toohey's description during the trial and things like that, but I'm pulling out all these little details of what a temple means to them. So Toohey later describes that that a temple should be soaring lines reaching for heaven, demanded by the very nature of a temple as a symbol of man's quest for something higher than his little ego. And then we have another, during the trial, another description. Of what is essential in a temple. And he describes it as two essentials of the conception of a temple are a sense of awe and a sense of man's humility. Now, this particular temple we're looking at right now is the Baha'i temple. It is not that kind of religion. So what we're reading about here is very specific to Western Christian religion. And so I wanted to give you an example of what he's talking about, this soaring sense of awe. And this is your French Gothic cathedral. Some people go these days to see French Gothic cathedrals and they don't get that sense of you're an infinitesimal blob. They get the sense of awe in a good way. And I wanted to kind of explain how you could get to what Toohey is looking for in a temple. And to do that, we kind of have to go back to the Middle Ages and get a sense for what this would have felt like to somebody of that era, rather than from our era of a place of skyscrapers and air travel and bridges and things like that. So I'm going to take you back to give you a little picture. So this is how people lived at that time. Windows were tiny little panes of glass, no bigger than your head. And you were lucky if you had glass in your house. Most often, windows were sheets of thin cloth or some other material. Sometimes they were caked in beef tallow to make them more air and watertight. The insides of buildings were colder and damper than the outsides usually. So these were really dark interior conditions. This picture is an illustration of it. You have tiny, tiny windows. You're heated with fire. Your only source of light is through candles, all of which are creating soot. So everything is covered in dark, dark material. So this is what is life on Earth to the average person at this time. So, and they're also, of course, illiterate. They don't read. They don't have that level of reading skill yet. So when they go to a church or a cathedral or a chapel and they see these stained glass windows, that was their books. That's how they learned about the scripture. It's through the pictures that were in the glass. So imagine your daily life existence in this dark, hard working 12, 18 hours a day just to get enough food to not starve. And then you walk into this. And not only is there such a plethora of glass, it's of the most utter richest material. These blue colors were extraordinarily rare to come by. And you didn't have the sense that we do to understand the way these rib vaults are working, that this is a structural marvel, truly. But that's not how it was intended. What's happening when that light shines through all of the glass is the structure disappears. It essentially becomes an otherworldly experience. And that's what Christianity at that time was doing in their buildings. They were creating in those cathedrals and those chapels, in those temples, a sense of deep, deep, profound contrast to what life was like for you as you existed and what it could be in heaven. Of course, how it all happened was taxes. But so I want to show I think Rob's pulling up there. No, I just want to go to the next picture here. But you
somehow I
messed that up. Okay, so we need to stop share for just a second. And then I want to read a couple of descriptions of what the Stoddard Temple turned out to be. And then we're going to go to that. That is page 319. So we have this interview Rourke has with Hopton Stoddard, where Stoddard, heavily coached by Toohey, says, the greatest aspiration of the human spirit towards the highest, the noblest, and the best. That's what he's looking for. And then he tells Rourke that I may wish to call it God, you may wish to call it another name, but what I want in that building is your spirit. Give me that. And of course, that's setting, we know now, that is setting him up. So what ends up happening with it, this is great stuff here. We end up with this description. The temple was to be a small building of gray limestone. Its lines were horizontal, not the lines reaching up to the heavens, but the lines of the earth. It seemed to spread over the ground like arms stretched at shoulder height, palms down, in great silence acceptance. It did not cling to the soil, and it did not crouch under the sky. It seemed to lift the earth, and its few vertical shafts pulled the sky down. It was scaled to human height in such a manner that it did not dwarf man, but stood as a setting that made his figure the only absolute, the gauge of perfection by which all dimensions were to be judged. Now, that little detail, scaled to human size, to a perfection, of course, instantly brings me to Frank Lloyd Wright, who did this on all of his buildings, as long as you were his height. So if you happen to be 5'8" or thereabouts, it was perfectly tailored to you. If you were 6'2", it felt really uncomfortable. So if you are taller than that and you happen to go see any of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings and can tour them, you'll get that sense of feeling almost like you need to go like this, because he does that enveloping of space so masterfully. We also then get the description that Dominique says at the end here, where she says, he thought that the place built as a setting for man was sacred. So I wanted to bring up a couple of different ideas of, and then none of these, I think, just to make sure you understand, I don't think any of these are what she's describing, because what she's describing doesn't really exist, in my view, in other buildings. But I wanted to show you a couple of options, and Rob just walked away. So I'm going to share this, hopefully successfully, on my own. So here's Frank Lloyd Wright's Unity Temple outside of Chicago. And if any of you, so here we're getting these horizontal lines. Now it isn't open the way that this Stoddard Temple is described, but this gives you a sense of that horizontality to it. And if any of you get a chance ever, I'm not sure that they're still doing this, but when we lived in Chicago, we used to go regularly to the Unity Temple for concert series. They used to have a series of concerts. You could buy tickets and go sit at the Unity Temple for a concert, little intimate ensembles and things like that. And because the inside was every place that you sat, you were so close to the stage, as it were, every single part felt like an intimate setting. So here is the inside of the Unity Temple, where you can see that sort of horizontality. But in this particular case, it's more enclosed, because that's what this is in a city setting, and they turn you inside. Frank Lloyd Wright is taking the city and turning you inside to this interior space. So I wanted to find you a place that did the opposite, that turned you outside. And I thought this is the necessary. This is by Ife Jones, who was one of Frank Lloyd Wright follower. This was finished in 1980 in the Ozark Mountains. And this is called Thorn Crown Chapel. And it's literally in the middle of the woods. Kind of a similar story to Hopton Stoddard, with the man who designed it, or not designed it, but had this built. In one respect, he was desperately looking for a way to build a temple to leave near the end of his life for the rest of the world. The inside, however, is not really a Christian temple. While there is the axiality that you would see in a church, this is very much, as you can see, it's about the forest around you, so much so that the forest and the building almost join together as one. And you can see there is no part of this that makes you feel like an infinitesimal soul, other than you just feel like you're in a man-made part of the forest. And here's another little detail of up in this is, I think, what Louis Sullivan would think of. This is a temple to nature. This isn't a method. This is about the awe and the joy and the enlightenment. It's not about the belittling sense. And I am going to stop share here. I had, you're going to have to stop share.
Yeah.
I had another part to describe. We get to this section when sadly the Stoddard Temple is rebuilt. And the line that I keep coming back to is this description of it being like a corpse hacked to pieces and reassembled. And I had a couple of horrific architectural examples of that exact thing happening in my architectural education. But probably fortunately for you, you're all going to be spared that because
we might come back another time.
we might have, Rob thinks they'll have to come back another time. I even have a picture to prove that it actually truly happened. But with that, I'm going to have to spare you the horrors of architectural history.
And I'll get things ready to go while you finish up.
Yeah.
Sherri, this
Yeah.
idea of asking you guys to do a lot works beautifully. Beautifully. We get temples and no corpses. We get building great temples and no dismembering of them. It is,
I like that, I really like that.
All of that. This is beautiful. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sherri. That was beautiful. I really love the temple series. And I think the color is really deep point.
I love
that contrast. The orange and the blue-green, beautiful.
Good. I really apologize. We would love to be here for the rest of this, as I'm sure you're all going to knock it out of the park. I can't wait to watch the recording later, but we wish we could join you, but we're going to go hear little ones play string instruments.
Sounds good. Sounds
all
good.
Right. Take care, everyone.
Next up, I'm thinking of, it's going to be Iris. Iris, are you ready to talk about the first characterization of characters, first description of characters? Would you unmute? Iris, can you try to unmute? Try it again.
Okay, hi.
There. So what we'll do is that we'll go with Iris, followed by Maritza, Rupali, and Joia. And then we'll open it up for comments. Iris, go ahead.
Okay, one of the things I found helpful is to really pay attention to the way Rand describes characters the first time they show up. And I keep referring back to those words. It helps me hold on to it because there are so many different ways she'll describe people. I find it very important that Dominique sees Rourke as strength made visible. It helped me understand what's going on with Chewie also, because he's seen the same thing. Rand doesn't use words there. And and there are two things Dominique sees: strength made visible and a God. Later, we hear her talk about the Enright house when she has no idea who that was created by, and that person shouldn't remain alive. I love what Rand does at the party. When she sees Rourke at Kiki's, all she knows is that he is strength made visible, the man who raped her. And there's no real description there. It's an explosion within her mind and within ours, but it's not described. It's in our mind. Then separately, probably 5-10 minutes later, she finds out that he's also the Enright house, this man who she thinks shouldn't even be alive. And I just love the fact that none of that is in words. We just see, and we have to know what's going on in her mind. I think of them as true explosions, several minutes apart. And then the thing I just mentioned, Chewie sees Rourke as strength made visible, which is a horror to him, whereas it's a God to her. To him, it's the worst thing possible. There is no way he can get his claws into him. Everyone else he can manipulate. This is someone who he cannot touch. And he's wiped out. It's as if Chewie is dead. He doesn't exist. And then the third character that I wanted to mention, this is something that Robert just alluded to. We have gotten to know Katie. We've seen her in several different situations, the effect she has on other people, what's going on in her life. It's almost halfway through the book that we understand what Tui sees in her and what she could have been. I think it's about 24 pages before the actual center of the book. And he sees her, and she is what it means to feel as the center of the universe. And it's made beautiful by the knowledge and the world in the eye of the witness. Looks like a better place for having such a center. And when he sees that in her is when he decides that she will live with him, because that's what he wants to destroy. And that's what he sees in a way in Rourke and can't destroy. He wishes he could. He's trying all through the book. But it's a beautiful description of her. And we haven't seen that of her. It's already gone by the time we find out that there was a moment when that was her. Just a few other little things going back. Robert Tracinski mentioned that Dominique is the positive character he likes least. And I always felt that until this reading, it was every time she came up, I'd have to go through 8 steps to figure out, what's going on with her and how to think about her. But this time I noticed the end of chapter 7, Rourke has bought into the same thing. It's like they're living this little play together. Rourke says he wouldn't want her if she didn't want to destroy him. So it's, this is who they are together. Small thing, Rand had this children's magazine, the French children's magazine that her mother got for her. Sophisticated educated Russians. There were many who only spoke and read French. Russian was this crude language they maybe used to speak to their servants. Okay, and then back to the rape again. It is so heavily foreshadowed in the, I don't know, it's half page or so, before Dominique and Rourke even see each other. There are at least 14 sentences and paragraphs that foreshadow the rape. It's just, and then one more thing related to it. Rourke hasn't seen it, but we know that she already belongs totally to Rourke. It's when the poet is going to drive her home and he kisses her shoulder and she reacts, she's surprised herself how she reacts. It's already set. Let's see, miscellaneous. $100 million is willed to Tui, which he gives to a charity that hires him to speak. In today's money, that's $1.8 million. And the Stoddard trial happens 1931, which is 2 years after the stock market crash. And I don't know, can I do one more little thing?
Please.
This goes with what Sherri did, I think it was last week. I've gotten so that I don't know the weeks because I've been watching the YouTubes. Outside Grand Central Terminal, there is a statue known as the Glory of Commerce, or sometimes it's called progress with mental and physical force. And other times it's just called transportation. It's about 5 stories tall. And it's Hercules for physical strength. That's on the left. On the right is Minerva, goddess of wisdom and protectress of cities. And the center is Mercury, god of travel and commerce. Well, and so it's part of that same time where business is shown in these classic statues. And let's see, two little things. I've always known that Dominique had a sunken bathtub. It's mentioned fairly early, but I'd never thought of that as the tub that she couldn't make herself get into. I always pictured her climbing up into a normal tub, but she could have just rolled into the one at ground level. And I don't think anyone has mentioned it, the boy on the bike. Rand always said that she wrote it for herself. She didn't expect it to mean anything to other people. And of course, it means a great deal to a lot of people. So, and later, I can do a little report on the Bauhaus, either today or next week when Sherri does hers.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Iris. Really like all your observations. My favorite one this time was the description of Katie from Eyes of Tuhi, where he sees in this young girl, quite vulnerable, the core of what makes life good and life possible. And then and there he chooses, okay, I need to destroy this.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. Really, please keep bringing anything that you have. And it brings so much richness to the conversation. Thank you. Next up is Maritza, followed by Rupali and Joia. Maritza.
So I'm gonna talk mostly about love, actually. So that's on the bottom of Shrikant's triangle, with thinking and action on the other sides. And so, I find myself thinking about that a lot in all these chapters, the idea that, the foundation, he has the foundation listed as love. And really, as we go through these chapters, it's rather shocking and fascinating, the manner in which love is portrayed here. And also was shocking for me personally, because I realized that for me, this book formed kind of a foundation for me of what I resonated most with for concepts of love and what love should be. And I spent a lot of time as I grew into an adult, almost apologizing for some of my views on love because they started from here. But so I want to talk about Katie, right? Katie and Peter. I want to start with them, because any little ounce or shred of respect I may have had for the character of Keating just died. Like in fact, I think I probably threw the book across the room the very first time when Dominique showed up at his house and proposed to him. And Sherri and Rob aren't here, but he talks about him sitting down. When he sat down and actually freaking considered it, I wanted to throw the book across the room. I was like, are you kidding me? You're literally packing to go marry the love of your life because you cannot handle the world and you have found your salvation. You're really considering this? You can't possibly know what love is. And I felt that so viscerally. And then just a little bit later in the book, I get what to me still reads as one of the most beautiful descriptions of a true love, a love so complete that it says to someone, I can't want you if you're not yourself in your absolute truest form. And as I'm viewing you standing here you're not ready to be with me. And so I will let you go. I forgive you for hurting me and not being able to be with me. That's the speech that Rourke gives Dominique in the very last paragraph of chapter 14. When she tells him that she's married Keating, he understands. He's understood her intuitively. She's trying to play these games. She's like, oh, I'm going to keep myself away from him. He doesn't. He goes right to her. He spoils the game because he knows he loves her. Now we see him as the character. Remember, he's the ideal in the book. So he has no game. He has no need to hide that this is the person he's fallen in love with. He sees no issue with it. He's allowing her to dictate the terms of their relationship because he sees that she requires further growth. And to me, the idea of being with someone that, so Ayn Rand says, and I really love the idea that when you see someone and you see your values reflected in them, that's the highest form of love. When you see this person and you want to meet them and both of you grow together, and what I see is a weaving. Like I've often really not been a fan of people say when two becomes one, it's the greatest. I've never agreed with that. Maybe that makes me very, very rare among most of the women in this world, but I've never wanted to be with a guy who wants to live for me. I don't want somebody to be my everything. That idea sounds terrible and awful to me. I like the idea of the intertwining. It looks almost like a DNA strand, you come together, you move parallel, you interweave, but you keep together parallel moving forward because, meaning, for there to be meaning, there must be movement. And the interesting thing, and I don't know if it's very subtle here, but if you guys notice, we've already seen the crescendo of Peter Keating. What we're watching now is his decline. So if we're looking at it from, the movement that Shrikant has shown us, Keating's dance is following a slightly different rhythm than some of the other characters. He's already on the decline. And so, Katie, she's been molded, right? And we don't quite understand until we get to these chapters. We don't quite understand how long it is and how pervasive it's been that her soul has been being chipped away. And I really loved Rob's bringing up the concept. So I actually was going to bring up those exact sections that he pointed out. And there's one more that Rob didn't point out. There's a conversation. So at the opening of the Cosmos Slotnick building, Peter doesn't feel the elation and the excitement that he thinks he should feel because of this major accomplishment. When he gets all these invitations to do all these things, he accepts Tui's invitation to dinner. And they have a conversation that is, both wretched and fascinating because they talk about this, about the soul. What Tui explains to Keating, the reason he's feeling this ennui is that he's seeking what he should not be seeking. And the funny thing is, I tell people, I don't think we should ever strive for happiness, but it's kind of horrifying to hear that same phrase presented in this like ugly, twisted light. Like my idea is because, you should be seeking the meaningful path and happiness is going to be a lovely byproduct. Tui is telling us the only meaning is in not wanting anything. That's horrifying, right? But in this dinner, he explains to Keating that the reason that he's not feeling this happiness, he's not feeling good, is because he's too concerned with the ego. And interestingly, in several moments in this chapter, whenever Tui is speaking, we're seeing more and more. There's a couple words that are used over and over. And I think that there's subliminal messaging for us from the author, from Ayn Rand, right? She brings up, so Tui, whenever he speaks, if you notice, he's talking a lot about ego. He's talking a lot about selfish versus selfless. And he also speaks about humanitarianism and himself being a humanitarian. We'll see that several times whenever he speaks. And it's becoming increasingly like, so the drumbeat of Tui is starting to go up. It's moving up, right? So the the thing here also that is interesting is when we're introduced to Tui's background, something that stands out, to me anyway, as unnatural, extremely unnatural, is this idea that he has no use for the emotional aspects that make us human. So I'm sitting there going, this guy's barely human. Remember, these are, if we're looking at ideals and their opposites, well, then it does make sense that if we have someone like Rourke, we must then have someone, because so Rourke is so true to himself. And Tui is interesting because he's not, that he's also super true to himself, but his self is so different. And it's like almost, because he doesn't have those basic things that make us human, I believe that's why he can function in the manner in which he is. I mean, he doesn't care for love. He thinks that, you know, marriage is a quaint thing. He believes that love and sex and any of these emotional feelings are just things that make us introspective and stop us from erasing the individual. And to me, the idea of erasing the individual is absolutely appalling. I think that's the surest path towards the destruction of any society, any community. If you have no individual, what have you got? Nothing. And so speaking of that, I'm going to just jump. I'm a little bit, I'm just trying to get some things in. So I cannot pass up the opportunity to read again my absolute favorite quote line of all time and everything. You guys have heard me say it a lot. Nobody here is surprised that I'm going to read it. But this is the appropriate time, right? This is also again at the end when Dominique has told Rourke that she's married Keating. He's going to tell her he loves her and she wants to stop him. But he says, you don't want to hear it, but I want you to hear it. So I'm going to tell you anyway. And before he goes into his speech, he tells her, if I told you to leave everything and come be with me, you would do it. She closed her eyes because she knows it's true. Now, he's not going to, because that, what I described earlier about the idea of the horror of having someone live for me in the absence of themselves, that's Rourke's position as well, which is part of the reason perhaps that it spoke to me so loudly. But this to me is one of the most beautiful decorations of love and the most beautiful views of love that I have ever seen in print. And I'm going to read it to you guys. I love you, Dominique, as selfishly as the fact that I exist, as selfishly as my lungs breathe air. I breathe for my own necessity, for the fuel of my body, for my survival. I've given you not my sacrifice or my pity, but my ego and my naked need. This is the only way you can wish to be loved. This is the only way I can want you to love me. If you married me now, I would become your whole existence, but I would not want you then. You would not want yourself. And so you would not love me long. To say I love you, one must first know how to say the I. The kind of surrender I could have from you now would give me nothing but an empty hope. If I demanded it, I'd destroy you. That's why I won't stop you. I'll let you go to your husband. I don't know how I'll live through tonight, but I will. I want you whole as I am, and you'll remain in the battle you've chosen. A battle is never selfless. And then he says to her, you must learn not to be afraid of the world, not to be held by it as you are now, never to be hurt by it as you were in that courtroom. I must let you learn it. I can't help you. You must find your own way. When you have, you'll come back to me. They won't destroy you, Dominique. And they won't, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, and they won't, apologies. They won't destroy me, Dominique, and they won't destroy you. You'll win because you've chosen the hardest way of fighting for your own freedom from the world. I'll wait for you. I love you. I'm saying this now for all the years we'll have to wait. And to me, he sees her more clearly than she could possibly see herself. To me, it's so utterly moving and beautiful. And this paragraph is the entire point of the whole book. What Ayn Rand is saying to us in every page of this book is that we have to find a way to love ourselves despite the fear that the world brings about in us. Dominique spends all her energy fighting, or not fighting, I guess, attempting to dismantle and destroy Rourke. Because ever since she met him, her biggest fear has come to life. She now wants something and knows or feels the world has her in its grip. She feels she's no longer free because she wants something. Howard Rourke has a quiet assurance that at some point she'll realize that a love that huge is not something to be feared, it's something to be embraced, and that she can be a very true version of herself while still embracing this love. But he sees that she's not there yet. And I think that it's so beautiful to say to someone, I see what you can be. And I forgive you for not being there yet. And that's so rare, right? That's so rare. And what makes me really sad for Keating and for Katie is that they see that in each other. They do. They don't have the eloquence or the surety of Rourke in his speech, but they see that whenever they get together and it's just the two of them in the room, they see it, they feel it, it's palpable. And it's just so heartbreaking that none of them can just reach for it enough to make it come to fruition. And it's their downfall, right? We see in Keating, and we'll see further as we go along, Keating's absolute destruction for not following his heart. And I really, so, for me, that this paragraph is like, this to me is the heart of the entire novel. And this is why I've always been a huge fan of Dominique. And this, I hope, this paragraph allows those who are not huge fans of Rourke to understand him a little bit better. What comes off as arrogance is just a quiet surety. When one is so certain of one's core, one need not seek acceptance of others. And unfortunately, that presents as arrogance and shortness and dismissal. But when you see it's none of those things, like in these chapters, it's described a little bit. They describe the relationship that he and Dominique have in secret and separate from real life, as it were, where she doesn't just come over for sex. They go on drives, they go to the beach, they hang out, they swim. She loves to watch him work, to watch him swim. They have an entire relationship. And it's only when it's in the very beginning where it's glossed over that this is like for sex. I have tried a lot to reconcile the concepts of why Ayn Rand chose to start it with soul. So when I read the very first encounter they had sexual, to me, it didn't read as rape. It didn't. When she used the word, it was a shock to me. It really was. And I had a really hard time with that. And as I've read it more, I have more and more hard time with it. It's harder to read and to reconcile that with the rest of the book. It really is. I think it may have been done for shock value and to present the idea of a juxtaposition within the character of Dominique, where she needed it to be out of her control. We see that continually as the novel progresses, and she embraces that. She's the one who uses the word. When we see it from Rourke's perspective, he says he knew it was the only way she would allow him access to her. So what we see in him is that he's decided this is a person he wants in his life, and he's willing to meet her on her terms. And I don't want to, I'm not trying to forgive or anything, concepts of rape, but in this book specifically, to me, that's the way I view it, that it's a shock value to point out to us how very fiercely she wants to reject anything from the world. She has an ideal. And you see it actually when she's in the courtroom and she's defending Rourke. What she says is, it speaks volumes for where she is and how she views the world. She talks about how she blames Rourke and how he's wrong for allowing the world access to this temple. Because in her view, it is absolute folly to give so much of yourself to the world, which is so undeserving and so surely to hurt you with it. He views it differently. And, we see that. And when he says a speech to her about love, he tells her, they're not going to break me. I'm going to be fine. They're not going to break you. You're going to be fine. She believes neither of those things. And he's willing to let her go. And he really believes that she has to go through whatever she's going to go through. And she has to see it that way before she can come to him. And we'll walk through that with her. But one other thing I want to bring up is I want to mention Mallory for a moment. We haven't really talked about Mallory, but I love the interaction with him and Rourke, the very first beginning. So when we see Mallory, he's a broken man. He had the court thing where he tried to shoot Dewey. He's like, drinking himself in a corner in some little squalid motel. So he doesn't really believe Rourke, or Rourke says he wants to see him. But when Rourke comes to tell him that he wants him and him alone, he tells him, why on earth would you want me? And he doesn't and he tells him he doesn't believe him. He's like, oh, everybody says they want me, but then they don't really want me. But he keeps asking Rourke why. And this is another, so in these chapters, we see Rourke speak way more than we did in all the previous ones. And again, I'm hoping for some of you who weren't super into Rourke, I hope this brings you over to Rourke's side, because the quiet confidence and to me, it's the strength. He has a strength of core that is like amiable, and it's the ideal, right? We are emotional creatures. None of us can be Rourke 100% of the time. But when I read some of the things he says, to me, I'm like, oh, I want to be Rourke at least some of the time, right? And so he tells Mallory, he actually walks up to Mallory and physically touches him, which to me is huge, because in almost every descriptive scene you hear of with Rourke and other people, he's very aloof. He's very, very separate. He puts off very, very fierce and strong, don't touch me, I don't like you vibes. That's what people get from Rourke. For Mallory, he actually walks up to Mallory and tips his chin. He touches this man, which you won't hear him do that to anyone else. He doesn't actually even ever do it to Dominique first. He allows Dominique to come out to him in almost every scene that we see him with Dominique, save for the very first one, right? And he tells him, you have no right to care what I think of your work, what I am, or why I'm here. You're too good for that. But if you want to know it, I think you're the best sculptor we've got. I think it because your figures are not what men are, but what men could be and should be, because you've gone beyond the probable and made us see what is possible, but possible only through you, because your figures are more devoid of contempt for humanity than any work I've ever seen, because you have a magnificent respect for the human being, because your figures are the heroic in man. And I didn't come here to do you a favor, or because I felt sorry for you, or because you need a job pretty badly. I came for a simple, selfish reason, the same reason that makes a man choose the cleanest food he can find. It's a law of survival, isn't it? To seek the best. I didn't come for your sake. I came for mine. And that also shines a spotlight on Rourke to his very, very core. He does things from within, and they flow out with that core intact. And this is also the very heart of what Ayn Rand is trying to show us from a philosophical perspective. Our nature is to seek the best. And what Tui's trying to kill is that very nature. That's what we're seeing. He was working on Katie, he's working on Keating. And that right there is what we're seeing progressing here. And so, love is the base of the triangle that Shrikant presented to us. And then, you have the buttresses of thinking and action. And the fascinating thing about this is that we get to see several different flavors and aspects of love, plus the thinking and the action. Now, in Rourke, all three are in alignment throughout every step of his walking. In Dominique, her thinking and her action don't align with her love, but they also don't align for Keating or for Katie for vastly different reasons. And it's interesting, we're going to see how they move along this triangle as the book progresses, and they take different approaches. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see how it works for us. And there's so much more to say, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you, Shrikant.
Maritza, you made many amazing presentations before, but I think this is by far the best that I've seen. This is just incredible. So I want to say a few things. So what Rourke and Dominique have is the vertical axis of the I seeking for the highest. Dominique has that throughout. There is no question at all about that. And that is the source of their love for each other. The difference is that Rourke knows that that axis is powerful enough to transform the world and create the world for itself. Whereas Dominique is afraid that that vertical axis cannot survive in the world, that it has to be protected. So in that sense, she's similar to Winan. She's similar to Mallory, who's afraid of the beast. Similar to Winan, who wants to keep that away, in a separate gallery or on his yacht. Now, one of the most beautiful ideas that I came up with, that I heard actually from a friend, is the concept of distance. Okay, so you have these two vertical axes. So in my diagram, imagine like that Rourke is in the main diagram, the vertical axis, he's there, the I, and Dominique is a vertical axis right next to him at a distance. Okay, now if you look at the distance, so both of them are vertical axis. To have a vertical axis means to respect the vertical axis of the other person and to know that there is a difference, that their context is different. They are going to integrate with a world differently. They are going to create things differently. It's so that distance and respecting that distance is crucial to actual love, because if you think that it is going to be coincident, then you are saying that they don't have an identity, separate identity. Now, if you look at it, Rourke does two things with Dominique. On one hand, he gives her the distance. He respects the distance that he knows, he's telling her that, look, you have the vertical axis. They're not going to destroy me. They're not going to destroy you. But you have to learn in your own way. And I'm going to give you space and time to learn it. But on two critical occasions, you talked about the intersection. The intersection is also crucial. When he's building the temple, he reaches out to Dominique. That's first. And second, when he's doing the Cortland explosion, he reaches out to Dominique. And you can see how beautifully chosen those points are. How they speak to who she is and what she needs to learn, and brings everything into focus for her and to enable her process of growth. So it's just beautiful, those two intersections, which really help her learn in the most intense way possible, each of them. she learns something with the with the temple, that it's not about Peter Keating. And she learns with the Cortland tile that it's not about Winan. So Peter Keatings cannot defeat, first thing she learns, Peter Keatings cannot defeat Howard Roark. And then she learns that it's Winan actually does not have the power. And so it's both kind of the distance and the intersections. So beautifully put. Thank you. Thank you so much, Maritza. Next up is Rupali.
Thank you, Shrikant. I will say, following up with what Sherri was saying, when you walk into a Frank Lloyd Wright building, a house, I just feel it's made to my scale. And it just feels so right. But then my husband, who's taller, has to kind of stoop a little bit. But it just is a very warm, nice feeling when you know that the space is made to your scale. And I want to talk about the contrast. I know that Maritza also talked about it, and this is a theme throughout, even when Sherri talked about the contrasting colors on the color wheel. The contrast in this book to bring about the key points is really very well done. In this section, there's the clear contrast between Toohey and Roark and their personalities. So here is Toohey, the humanitarian, and their first meeting where Toohey knows, he becomes aware of Howard Roark in the room, and is curious about him. And he doesn't know yet who he is, but just the presence of Howard Roark in the room makes him feel uncomfortable, or makes him feel intrigued, or makes him feel, and yet when somebody says, let me introduce you, he says, no, I'm okay. And how many times has that happened to us, where somebody will, they're intrigued and we say, let me introduce you, and they are afraid to be introduced to that person, because just the presence of his being is uncomfortable for someone who is like Toohey, who cannot stand that in a human being. So, and then when they end this section, they end with the two of them meeting again. So Ayn Rand has them meet again at the end of this part 2, and Toohey asks Howard Roark, what do you think of me? And he says, but I don't think of you. And so here the section starts with him wondering who Roark is, and ends with Roark really not even thinking about Toohey, because he is so anchored in his own being. Now, the sense of life that Toohey has, and the sense of life that Howard Roark has, is very well put in this section. So I want to talk about Ellsworth Toohey starting off as a 7-year-old boy. Now, developmentally, the sense of justice between the ages of 7 and 15 is very heightened. And you can see, I'm just amazed at how much Ayn Rand knew about children and about the human brain. As it always fascinates me, because I always felt that she hadn't written enough about children. But here you can see the 7-year-old Ellsworth, and he is not a very strong boy, but he has this sense of justice or injustice done to him with this bully, who he decides one fine day to kind of just soak him with the water hose. And this action is done out of spite. And you see this when you're working with children. You'll see children getting back at someone with in a spiteful manner just to get their way, and then talking to them about whether it was right or wrong. The whole idea of teaching children what is right and what is wrong, what is immoral and what is moral, that distinction has to be taught between the ages of 7 to 15. And it's in Montessori, we say it's now or never, because if you don't teach them those differences at that age, they're going to grow up to be people without a strong ethical background. So that's the kind of a child who he is. And then he learns that, okay, here's religion, but then he really doesn't want to be very religious, because he realizes that in religion, religion overemphasized the importance of the individual spirit. Now, having gone through conversations with, Gospel of John and Tao Te Ching and Bhagavad Gita, we see what, if you take out all the dogma behind religion, you see that all religions, they kind of point towards the core of the human being. Religion preached nothing but a single concern, the salvation of one's soul, one's own soul. And clearly Ellsworth did not want to do that. He didn't want to acknowledge that human soul. In fact, he says, to mortify the flesh is nothing. To mortify the soul is the only act of virtue. And he goes on to, Ayn Rand goes on to say how Ellsworth too, he thought about other people, and he wanted to be acknowledged and wanted to fit in, which is again a very strong need of the adolescent age. And so when Ellsworth too is in college, he wants to be acknowledged by his peers. And so he gathers all the people who are weak and not the people who are strong. So, if you ask someone, who do you want to be in a room with? And you want to be with people who are better than you, or, who you can, but he wants to be the best amongst all so that he can have the control and he can have the power. And so he always had a sizable following among young heirs, the second and third generation millionaire. He did not have much success among the poor boys working their way through college, because those children had the grit and the resilience to fight for themselves, to go after their own dreams. And that was the kind of person that Howard Roark was when we first met him in chapter 1, where Howard Roark loves. He had that resilience and grit in him to persevere through whatever obstacles would come his way. So then the kind of books that Ellsworth too reviewed when he started reviewing books, it was not books about heroism, but it was mostly about the soil in which the humans grew, or nothing really that added to the human heroism, but he preferred novels without a plot, and above all, novels without a hero. So you can see the kind of character he's becoming in these through her depiction of him. And Maritza made this point about his, that's also the time when young people fall in love, and he had no interest for women. He didn't understand what love was. So that's the other aspect. And he goes on to say, let us aspire to no virtue which cannot be shared. So the worst folk song is superior to the best symphony. And you can see how very clearly Ayn Rand is building his character of somebody who does not care for the highest in the human beings. Now, if you look at how he influences other people, so we saw early on that if somebody wants to follow a career and wants to become a musician, he'll say, no, you have a lot of talent for that, but that's not what you should be studying. And, oh, you want to become an architect? No, you should probably do something lesser. So he really kills the drive in young adults, and then he brings them together in this clubs that really have no purpose or no sense of actually doing anything except rallying for his own causes so that he can control them. And the worst is when we see what he does with Katie when she comes, and Rob talked about this in his part where she comes to him all distraught, and she has done everything that he has taught her, to be selfless, to accept the poor, and to give herself to serving others. And she says, but I have nothing of my own and I'm miserable. And so are the other women like me. I don't know a single selfless person in the world who's happy except you. And he asks her, do you really want me to tell the answer? Because you know, you've already given the answer yourself in the things you said about the fact that you're unhappy, about Katie Halsey and nothing else. It was the most egotistical speech I've ever heard in my life. And when Stoddard comes to him, and well, actually he goes and approaches Stoddard for the temple. When Stoddard wants to build a temple for religion, because that's what he believes in, he tells Stoddard that, well, you should not really build that. You should build for children who have lesser than what you do. And when the temple, where, you know, he sets up Rourke so that the temple would fall. And Stoddard is shocked, and he is trying to make sense of this. He says to Stoddard, well, God has chosen his way of rejecting your offering. So now he's just turning it around for even the core belief that a person has in whatever they value. He did not consider you worthy of presenting him with a shrine. I guess you can fool me, Hopton, and all men, but you can't fool God. He knows that your record is blacker than anything I suspect. So just making people feel terrible about themselves. Now, on the other hand, the contrast is Howard Rourke. And we see that in Wright building, when people come to see his building. Let me just get to that page. Give me just a second. So when people come to the Enright house, they see a purposeful human will. It made the house alive in a strange personal way of his own, so that the minds of the spectators, 5 words ran dimly without object or clear connection in his image and likeliness. So people could sense his sense of life, even in the creation that he made. So when, Shrikant, you talk about the triangle, if you have a strong core and the karma, the yoga, the action that you do is related to your purpose, and because there's that connection, the world that you create is created with love for humanity, and it just flows. It kind of shows in this passage. How does he influence young people around him? So there's the photographer from Banner who is just starting out in his career, and he sees Rourke's face lifted to the building. The photographer was a young boy, new to his job. He did not know much about it, but he loved his work. He had been an amateur photographer since childhood. So he snapped a picture of Rourke in that moment, in that one moment. And when he sees Rourke, the young photographer glanced at Rourke's face and thought of something that had puzzled him for a long time. He had always wondered why the sensations one felt in dreams was so much more intense than anything one could experience in walking reality. Why the horror was so total and the ecstasy so complete, and what that extra quality, which could never be recaptured afterward, the quality of what he felt when he walked down a path through tangled green leaves in a dream, in an air full of expectation, of causeless, utter rapture. And when he awakened, he could not explain it. It had been just a path through some woods. He thought of that because he saw that extra quality for the first time in existence. He saw it in Rourke's face lifted to the building. So you can see Ellsworth to his influence on young minds and Rourke's influence on young minds. Then Ayn Rand, she goes on to talk about how Rourke was as a boss to his employees. And she said his staff loved him. They did not realize it and would have been shocked to apply such a term as love to their cold, unapproachable, inhuman boss. These were the words they were used to describe Rourke. These were the words they had been trained to use by all standards and conceptions of their past. Only working with him, they knew he was none of these things. He responded only to the essence of a man, to his creative capacity. In his office, one had to be competent. It was granted not as a gift, but as a debt. It was granted not as affection, but as recognition. And she goes on to say, Rourke made mistakes in choosing his employees. I can say this happens to every employer, but he made mistakes in choosing his employees occasionally, not often. Those whom he kept for a month became his friends for life. They knew only in a dim way that it was not not loyalty to him, but the best within themselves. So you can see the part about how he loves humanity. You can see that in the work that he does and with the people that he works with. Also in the way he approaches Mallory. And when he first, and Maritza talked about how he first sees him and meets him. And Rourke says Rourke walked over to Mallory, lifted his chin, knocking it upward, and said, "You are a goddamn fool. You have no right to care what I think of your work or what I am or why I'm here. You're too good for that. But if you want to know it, I think you're the best sculptor we've got. I think because your figures are not what men are, but what men could be and should be. Because you've gone beyond the probable and made us see what is possible, but possible only through you." So he can recognize the best in other people and he can bring out the best in other people. So that's the other part. Now, Ellsworth Toohey, he's bringing out the worst in Peter Keating by encouraging him to do the wrong things. So what their sense of life is and how Rourke says, I can only go down to such point of pain. Beyond that, I don't feel any pain because he knows that nothing can shake his steadfastness in his own core. And then the vision of the statue, I think that's another place where we can see. I'm actually going to read Dominic's testimony for that, where she talks about what Rourke thinks about the statue and what Toohey thinks about the statue. So let me just get to that page here. Dominic says, Howard Rourke built a temple to the human spirit. He saw man as strong, proud, clean, wise, and fearless. He saw man as a heroic being, and he built a temple to that. A temple is a place where man is to experience exaltation. He thought that exaltation comes from consciousness of being guiltless, of seeing the truth and achieving it, of living up to one's highest possibility, of knowing no shame and having no cause for shame, of being able to stand naked in full sunlight. He thought that exaltation means joy, and that joy is man's birthright. He thought that a place built as a setting for a man is a sacred place. That is what Howard Rourke thought of man and of exaltation. So here's Howard Rourke's view of man, and then she talks about Ellsworth Toohey. She says, but Ellsworth Toohey said that this temple was a monument to profound hatred of humanity. Ellsworth Toohey said that the essence of exaltation was to be sacred out of your wits, to fall down and to grovel. Ellsworth Toohey said that man's highest act was to realize his own worthlessness and to beg forgiveness. Ellsworth Toohey said it was depraved not to take for granted that man is something which needs to be forgiven. Ellsworth Toohey saw that this building was of man and of the earth. And Ellsworth Toohey said that this building had its belly in the mud. To glorify man, Ellsworth Toohey said, was to glorify the gross pleasures of flesh, for the realm of the spirit is beyond the grasp of man. To enter that realm, said Ellsworth Toohey, man must come as a beggar on his knees. Ellsworth Toohey is a lover of mankind. And so you have this contrast between Howard Roark and Ellsworth Toohey. And I want to share, a couple of weeks ago, Sherri asked about the importance of work in a Montessori classroom. I want to share the story about the humanitarian at our school. And we have this 9-year-old child who has taken upon himself to be the voice of the classroom. And he stands up for every student and feels that there's injustice when any child is disciplined, even for the smallest reason. And what we noticed in the classroom was that children were actually feeling very unhappy. And parents were very upset, and I decided to spend time in this classroom. And I spent a few days in the classroom working with the students. And here's what I saw. I saw that this one particular boy was, as I said, this is the age when the sense of justice is very heightened in children. And so if a teacher disciplined any child, I was working with a student and another child was talking, and I said, can you please not talk? And this boy just stood up and he said, it's not his fault. I was talking to him. And I said, well, then please don't talk. I'm working with this child and this is quiet work time. Continue working. And he just burst into tears. And he said, I just don't understand why I have to stand up for my friends. And I get in trouble. And I said, okay, so now there was all this drama. All students are around him because he is in tears and he is sobbing. And so I said, okay, why do you feel that your friends can't speak for themselves? Do you feel that they don't have the ability to articulate the way you do? Are they weak? Are they strong? And so we had this conversation. And at the end of it, he said, all right, I'm going to let them speak for themselves. And one thing we did was we said, all right, instead of getting caught up in this drama, the teachers started giving them much larger works that they could engage in. So there was a project where they had to build robots and they had to come up with ideas for how to use sound. The different projects that they were doing in the classroom, the teachers kind of just ramped it up. And so one child was researching, colonizing Mars. Another child was doing something about robots. Another child, she was working on coral reefs. And so now these children were completely focused on their work. And we were able to remove the distraction of, one child speaking for everybody. And once that element of gossip, once that element of feeling of, I'm not served was removed, the classroom began to hum. And every day at the end of the day, I would say, all right, let's do an emotional check. How did you feel? A smiley face, an okay face, a sad face. First day, about a third said happy face, a third said okay face, a third said sad face. And I said, all right, let's see, why are you sad? And one person said, well, I didn't like to be interrupted. One person said, I couldn't get my work done. And when I came to this boy, he said, I don't know. I have no reason to be unhappy, but I'm just unhappy. And so the next day we continued. And the next day, everybody was left the school happy except this one boy. And I said, what's going on? And he said, well, I didn't have anybody to talk to because everybody was busy working. And I said, okay. And then the next day we met again. And now he moved from being unhappy to okay day. And I said, wow, that's a change. What changed for you? Why did you become, why did you turn a corner? And he said, well, I decided that I'll just have a positive attitude and I won't, interrupt other people. And by this time, all children had made do not disturb cards for themselves. So They had do not disturb cards on their tables while they were working, and this child couldn't disturb them. And now, 2 weeks later, the classroom is humming, the parents are happy, the children are happy, he is happy, because he doesn't have to be the voice for everybody. Every human being has that in themselves. So when I was reading Ellsworth Toohey's story, I just thought of this child and how, our environment can create Tooheys, and our environment can create Howard Roarks. It's up to us as adults how we provide that for children. So that was one. The other contrast was between Joel Sutton and Kent Lansing. And here you have Joel Sutton, who cannot make up his own mind. He's going to do what everybody else is doing. Just because Wright has done that, I'm going to hire Howard Roark. And Dominique, she's just amazing at this. And she says, well, you're not, he says, I want your opinion. Should I hire Howard Roark? And she is now on a campaign to not allow any projects to come Howard Roark's way. And so she says, well, you're not Wright. You don't want great. You just want good. You're not going to be able to stand up for what's great. And it takes a certain kind of man. And he doesn't even get that. He just doesn't even understand that. And he goes off to say, well, I'm not going to hire you, Howard Roark, because Miss Francon says so. And then we have someone like Kent Lansing. And I don't know how many people over here have worked with boards, but I've worked with schools that have boards, and boy, they are just a disaster. I can share many examples, but it's mostly about status and about getting together to not really promote the mission of the school, but to take down people who are actually doing the work. And so Kent Lansing says, have you ever known a board to do anything? As, of course, you like me, as I know I'd like you. Men are brothers, and they have a great instinct for brotherhood, except in boards, unions, corporations, and other chain gangs. And he goes on to talk about how all board members talk to each other and decide whether they're going to vote for this or that, not because they believe in an idea. He says it's so much easier to pass judgment on a man than on an idea. Though how in hell one passes judgment on a man without considering his brain is more than what I can understand. He says, I'm hiring you because you're a good architect. So he says, why are you a good architect? Because you have certain standards of what is good. They're your own, and you stand for what is good, and they're my own. And you are the one who can give me what I want. And so he goes on about integrity is the ability to stand by your own idea. So here, I just wanted to talk about these contrasts between Howard Roark and Toohey, between Kent Lansing and Joel Sutton. And of course, then we have the love between Dominique and Howard Roark, and the relationship between Katie and Peter Keating, which Maritza spoke really well, so I'm not going to get into that. But one thing that Howard Roark says to Dominique is, you have to learn that there is, a place for people like you and me. And he, as Shrikant said earlier, he gives her the time and space, and he kisses her goodbye and lets her go. And that letting go is such a big part of a relationship, of a successful marriage, so to say, or of a relationship between two people. I think Ayn Rand has done such a phenomenal job in part 2, showing these contrasts and how our lives are made up of these issues, and how Howard Roark shows us one way and Ellsworth Toohey shows us the other way. Thank you.
Wonderful, Rupali. I thought you did a fantastic job of talking about Ellsworth Toohey. So I'm going to take only 5 minutes to show this in the diagram, and then we'll go to Joia. Give me just a second. We've started this one. I'm going to go to this. Okay. All right. This is the new words I have for this, for the same. So you have your I here that is seeking the highest. This is your spirit. That's what, how, you know, that's the cause of everything. That's the function. That's the cause of everything. So if you compare this triangle to the inner triangle in the opposite direction. So really it is, the theme is not Howard Roark versus Peter Keating. It is Howard Roark versus Ellsworth Toohey, because he's moving in this direction. He's destroying the spirit. And let's look at exactly how he's destroying it. So this loop, let's just go through this loop once over here. What is happening is that he's destroying people's ability to conceptualize the highest. This is the highest truth that you know. So he's destroying truth. He's destroying the highest conception and thereby destroying the I. What that is doing is that is actually increasing the fear in people like Peter Keating or Sutton, that is making them go this way. And then there is a whole bunch of people like Winan who are exploiting that fear in his publishing empire in order to produce ideas to employ a whole bunch of Tooheys to keep doing that. So this is the loop that is going on. And the words I have here is that the Ellsworth Toohey is destroying. So it is destroy versus actually seek the highest. You're destroying. Here, instead of love, it's fear. And here, instead of build, where you're building, adding to the world, you're exploiting the fear of other people in order to sell them a falsehood or a lower vision, a low vision of who they are. So that's the circle. Let me go ahead, and next up is going to be Joia. Give me just a second. I'm going to stop sharing. Joia.
Well, thank you. And thank you for this update of the triangle. I love the update. And I was going to plan on talking about the triangle anyway, and now I'm going to be able to say so much more with the way that you've upgraded it. So thank you for sharing that. So I really did want to spend time talking about Ellsworth Toohey today, but I did just have to make one comment underlining something that Maritza said in her presentation about how she got so frustrated in that scene when Peter Keating knows that Katie is his lifeline and just throws it away without a seeming thought. And I definitely had the same experience. And perhaps this is just the way that I read books, but when I'm in a novel, I'm so right there in the moment with the characters. And so even though I've read the book multiple times before and I know exactly what's going to happen, like the best way I can think of describing my experience is, you know, how you get up in the morning and you have a plan for your day. And so, you think you know how your day is going to go, but you always know that in actual life, things could happen and it could go differently from the way you've planned it. So when I read a book, when I'm there with the characters, it's like I'm there with them in that moment again. And I'm so waiting for Peter Keating to make a different choice this time. And of course, he never does. And I get so angry every time. I don't think I've ever actually thrown the book, but I've been very tempted to. So I definitely understand Maritza's feelings there. Today, though, I wanted to talk about another character that I've really struggled with in my own understanding and appreciation for this character. So I think we're going to say that ultimately I'm going to come out on the side of Team Ellsworth Toohey. But it's a definite struggle to get there. And I have a lot to talk about, even my own process and how I've grown in different readings of this book of understanding this character. But ultimately, I realized what I want to say about this character is what frustrates me about this character, but how I ultimately appreciate the character is very similar to how I feel about Dominique. And so to recap that, the way I can describe it is I see that character as definite romanticism, but I'm not quite so sure about the realism. And ultimately, my sense of life is I love the combination. And so in this book particular, I love Howard Work, because to me, Howard Work just is the embodiment of romantic realism. There's that definite realism in the way that Ayn Rand based that character on herself, on her own vision of herself as an artist, as a writer, as a creator, and then just in this great stylized way. Kind of as Maritza suggests, we perhaps can't all be as consistent as Work, and even Ayn Rand herself probably was never as consistent as Work, but there's that realism aspect with the romanticism that we can aspire to. But with Tui, I see the romanticism, but ultimately, I'm not quite sold on the realism. But I want to start this exploration by talking about some of the realism that I think is there in Ellsworth Tui. And so I wanted to start this conversation even by talking about one of Ayn Rand's inspirations for this character. So for Ellsworth Tui, she talks about how she was definitely inspired by this politician, intellectual named Harold Laski, who was a leader of the British Labour Party, so definitely a prominent socialist, and then also a spokesperson for Marxism eventually. And this person, Lasky, was someone who she even saw in person ultimately and got a lot out for this character. And so I wanted to read even from the biographical interviews here of how Harold Lasky inspired Ayn Rand's characterization of Tui. So she says, I don't remember a word of that first lecture, but what impressed me was that it was completely the soul of Tui in the flesh. I had the character in a general sense, but the mannerisms, the kind of sarcasm, the kind of pseudo-intellectual snideness that he projected was invaluable. That's one experience that interests me as creative imagination. In other words, as epistemology, to analyze what was it that just seeing him on that platform gave me for the character of Tui, but it gave everything. That is, thereafter, all I had to do is remember how that man lectured, and I would know how Tui would act in any circumstance. He gave me the complete sense of life of that type. Even at that, I think I naturally glamorized. I mean, Tui, as I presented him, is much larger scale than Lasky, who was a cheap little snide pink. But the essential qualities of Tui is what he projected in an unmixed way. And the sarcasm about the British Empire and sarcasm about important issues in a sort of cheap, offhand manner. His whole manner consisted of lecturing on serious subjects with sarcasm and inappropriate sarcasm as his only weapon, and is acting as if he were really a very charming scholar in a drawing room, only you could kind of feel the bad teeth behind all that smile. It would feel something enormously evil. And the appearance, of course, I took baldly and literally. I don't know whether you should state this, whether his heirs would be entitled to sue me or what, but the appearance was so ideal that I drew a sketch of him during that lecture, which I think I still have somewhere, just a tiny one, with the narrow cadaverous face and glasses and the big ears, and I couldn't resist it. I mean, I would not have been able to change that appearance. It was so artistically perfect for the type. That was one source. And then I went a second time simply to observe a few characteristic touches. I don't think I ever used any of them literally, but it helped to make the type real. I had Tui in mind before I saw Lasky, only Lasky fitted the image. In other words, as if I had an abstract drawing, and these four, Lasky, Fadiman, Brown, and Mumford, helped me to fill in the details. So if you heard that description and like me, you were curious, what did this person Lasky actually look like? It's wonderful. So I first read this book in the 90s. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have YouTube. But in the age of YouTube, I actually found this short 30-second black and white silent video. So you can actually see Harold Lasky in the flesh and see Ayn Rand's vision of what she saw. And maybe you can see if this matches your vision of the character. And I will say, and maybe this is just speaks to Ayn Rand's power as a writer, but when I first saw this video, I took one look and said, oh, that is exactly how I pictured the character in my mind. So I think if, this was the image she was trying to create, it definitely worked that way for me. So I guess you can see if you'll agree here. So I'm just gonna share my screen here so I can show you this quick video clip. Can everyone see my screen here?
Yep.
Right, so you're going to see the guy with the glasses. This is going to be Harold Lasky. It's just a couple seconds so you can see but as she described, just some of his mannerisms, the way he's smiling, the way he's going to interact with these people. You're going to see he's going to go sit down in this chair with a kind of very smug, self-satisfied way that always looks to me exactly how I would imagine Tui sitting down here to have a conversation perhaps with Katie. So that's maybe our vision of what Tui looks like in the flesh. So I'm gonna stop here and stop. Wait, can I stop? All right. Oh no, wait, that's not my video. Where's my stop share?
Joia, I'll take care of it.
Okay, thank you. All right, so yeah, thank you for stopping the share for me. So I would say this definitely to me is Tui in the flesh, but in my reading, at least I've come to see that I don't think Lasky actually matches Tui in the spirit. And this might even be just something about my own journey of trying to grapple with this character. So when I first read this book, I think I mentioned I was 13 years old. And I have to say, at that time, I really didn't have any knowledge of Marxism or socialism. And so, I read this book and thought, oh, like Marxists must be like Tui. But since then, I've done a lot more reading and learning. I spent time as a graduate student in English. And if you know anything about even sort of the history of the development of Marxists, a lot of the, Marxists has gone through even many kinds of evolutions from classical Marxism through cultural Marxism, critical Marxism. We have now like the feminists and the postmodern and the race Marxists. And if you're an English department, all of them will show up as different teachers. So I've kind of experienced sort of all of the divisions of Marxism and what it is to be that kind of Marxist intellectual. And have learned that Tui really is not in any way a kind of Marxist intellectual. He doesn't really share any of the premises of that worldview. I think the better way to describe Tui is that he is really on what I would consider the Ayn Rand religion, but is bitter. So he has all of the premises of the worldview of the Ayn Rand religion, but then is bitter toward it, and because of that, wants to destroy it. And so now there's even this question of, what even might I mean by the Ayn Rand religion? So I even wanted to share something from the foreword of The Fountainhead, where she starts to talk explicitly about religion, and I think it just kind of gives us some insight into exactly what I'm talking about. It gives us some insight into, I think, who Tui is, and I think we're going to make some really interesting connections with Shrikant's diagram with the triangles and the spirals there. But so this is Ayn Rand on religion in the introduction to The Fountainhead. She says, religion's monopoly in the field of ethics has made it extremely difficult to communicate the emotional meaning and connotations of a rational view of life. Just as religion has preempted the field of ethics, turning morality against man, so it has usurped the highest moral concepts of our language, placing them outside this earth and beyond man's reach. Exaltation is usually taken to mean an emotional state evoked by contemplating the supernatural. Worship means the emotional experience of loyalty and dedication to something higher than man. Reverence means the emotion of a sacred respect to be experienced on one's knees. Sacred means superior to and not to be touched by any concerns of man or of this earth, etc. But such concepts do name actual emotions, even though no supernatural dimension exists. And these emotions are experienced as uplifting or ennobling without the self-abasement required by religious definitions. What then is their source or referent in reality? It is the entire emotional realm of man's dedication to a moral ideal, Yet apart from the man-degrading aspects introduced by religion, that emotional realm is left unidentified without concepts, words, or recognition. It is this highest level of man's emotions that has to be redeemed from the murk of mysticism and redirected at its proper object, man. It is in this sense, with this meaning and intention, that I would identify the sense of life dramatized in The Fountainhead as man worship. And so what I see there is that Ayn Rand really has this very deep sense of man's potential as the moral ideal. It is this whole, you could call it a philosophy, and I think she's right, to emphasize its connection with religion, with all of these terms that usually get associated with religion. And what we see in Toohey is that he ultimately has this kind of vision. This is part of his worldview. He doesn't believe in, dialectical materialism and, the conflict between the classes. He does see the importance of this potential of man as the creator. And sometimes he even has some of the most beautiful statements of what this vision is. So I even wanted to share one of these here, but I gotta get to my page here, where we really see how Toohey does share this premise of seeing what Shrikant in his diagram has been talking about, that vertical axis of the function that's seeking the highest possible, and of seeing that what is the ideal is this vision of man as the creator. So here's just a phrase that comes from Toohey, but I think it's just a beautiful expression of this worldview. This is when he's visiting with Dominique. So it goes, he got up, walked over to her, and stood looking at the lights of the city below them, at the angular shapes of buildings, at the dark walls made translucent by the glow of the windows, as if the walls were only a checkered veil of thin black gauze over a solid mass of radiance. And Ellsworth Toohey said softly, "Look at it. A sublime achievement, isn't it? A heroic achievement. Think of the thousands who worked to create this, and of the millions who profit by it. And it is said that but for the spirit of a dozen men here and there down the ages, but for a dozen men less perhaps, none of this would have been possible." And that might be true. If so, there are again two possible attitudes to take. We can say that these 12 were great benefactors, that we are all fed by the overflow of the magnificent wealth of their spirit, and that we are glad to accept it in gratitude and brotherhood. Or we can say that by the splendor of their achievement, which we can neither equal nor keep, these 12 have shown us what we are, that we do not want the free gifts of their grandeur, that a cave by an oozing swamp and a fire of sticks rubbed together are preferable to skyscrapers and neon lights, if the cave and the sticks are the limit of our own creative capacities. Of the two attitudes, Dominique, which would you call the truly humanitarian one? Because you see, I am a humanitarian. So here I think we're really getting to the essence of Toohey, that he sees the grandeur of man, the creator. But he has this bitterness. He knows that he himself cannot equal that vision. And we're gonna get throughout the story an even more explicit version of this, but what we're already seeing is that because he knows he cannot be Howard work, he's going to make it his intention to go out and destroy the Howard works of the world. And I do want to point out that, I think there is, to this point of realism, there is certainly something realistic about the envy, the nihilism. I mean, this is definitely a trait of psychology we see. I personally think it's definitely there. Unfortunately, in the psychology of a lot of people who are Marxists, there is sort of realism in that. But the disjunct for me is always like, would it even be possible for someone to have the Ayn Rand religion of man the creator, to be able to see that, and then to be able to turn on it in such a complete way? Like, is that psychologically even possible? Part of how that's so hard for me to be able to believe is because like there aren't even necessarily examples of it. Like as this quote suggests, there are perhaps even so few people who see the Ayn Rand religion. There's, Ayn Rand, there's Louis Sullivan, but is there even someone who could see with that depth of philosophical insight the Ayn Rand religion and then turn their backs on it so completely and still be able to maintain that psychology? So ultimately, it's kind of like the same problem I have with Dominique. Like can a person really see greatness with that amount of clarity and then really just be able to maintain a psychology of turning on it full time? Because that was even Ayn Rand's comment about Dominique, if you remember, that she said, Dominique was herself in a bad mood. And so maybe it's possible to have this kind of momentary bitterness to perhaps turn your back on it for a while, but is it really possible? And to me, I guess it is an open question, but from a realism standpoint, like there's part of me that just like doesn't really buy it, because on the one hand, realistically, the people that we know who are nihilists, who are Marxists, they don't have the vision. And it's not clear to me if the people who had the vision could really turn their backs on it in this full scale onslaught way. But all of that said, I ultimately want to say then that I do appreciate how for a novel, it does really make for a really great dramatic novel. That if you took out Toohey and just put in, any like actual realistic Marxist, or if you just put any nihilist character, like to me, the best example is like the Joker from Batman is always like a great example of a character that I think just represents the essence of nihilism. But you could tell that if you even just took that character and tried to put it into this book, it wouldn't have the same dramatic appeal as a character who actually deeply understands Rourke, really grasps that religion, grasps that philosophy, and is still going to be bent on destroying it. So this is ultimately how I come out on being for Ellsworth Toohey, as a character in the novel, precisely because he gives us this insight to Rourke. But what I also want to say is I think the best way to read Toohey is to read him for what he tells us about Rourke and this vision of the world that Rourke and Dominique at her best share. And so I wanted to end by quoting one of my favorite sections of the whole book, which is the very end of what we read through today, the end of part 2. And to me, as I said, this is a scene between Toohey and Rourke, but to me, the real value of this is what we learn about Rourke through the character of Toohey. So this is at the very end when Rourke is going to go see the destroyed Stoddard Temple. And Toohey has been hanging out there, just knowing that Rourke was going to come by eventually. And so he's just been hanging out at the temple, just waiting for that moment when Rourke would show up. So, hello, Mr. Rourke, said Ellsworth Toohey quietly. Rourke looked at him without curiosity. Hello, said Rourke. Please don't run away. The voice was not mocking, but earnest. I wasn't going to. I think I knew that you'd come here someday, and I think I wanted to be here when you came. I kept inventing excuses for myself to hang about this place. There was no gloating in the voice. It sounded drained and simple. Well, you shouldn't mind speaking to me. You see, I understand your work. What I do about it is another matter. You are free to do what you wish about it. I understand your work better than any living person, with the possible exception of Dominique Francon, and perhaps better than she does. That's a great deal, isn't it, Mr. Rourke? You haven't many people around you who can say that. It's a greater bond than if I were your devoted but blind supporter. I knew you would understand. Oh, no, sorry, I knew you understood. Then you won't mind talking to me? About what? In the darkness, it sounded almost as if Toohey had sighed. After a while, he pointed to the building and asked, do you understand this? Rourke did not answer. Toohey went on softly. What does it look like to you? Like a senseless mess? Like a chance collection of driftwood? Like an imbecile chaos? But is it, Mr. Rourke? Do you see no method? You who know the language of structure and the meaning of form. Do you see no purpose here? I see none in discussing it. Mr. Rourke, we're alone here. Why don't you tell me what you think of me in any words you wish? No one will hear us. But I don't think of you. And to me, that is just the powerful conclusion, and part of just the power of this book, because here we see Tui, who is a villain on this grand scale that I do believe is even grander than anything we might actually face in life. And if O'Rourke can face a Tui with this level of knowing how insignificant that would be, then I think it inspires us all to face perhaps whatever is coming against us and maintain our commitment to seeking the highest possible and working toward it and creating it in the world. Thank you.
Wow. All right. Joia, that was fantastic. I love the fact that you focused on the spirit. So I'm going to bring my diagram up one last time for a very short look at this. So I want to make 2 points. One point, I have this additional table over here that I'll come to in a minute. So you started by talking about the Ayn Rand religion, right? This is the core of your being, seeking high moral ideal. And Ayn Rand correctly points out that those themes are there throughout religion, but they have done it in a different way. My take on this, after studying all these religions, 3 different religions, Tao Te Ching, Gita, and the Bible, what I realize is firstly, it's beautiful to focus on Tui, because if you want to understand the spirit, you have to understand Mallory and Tui. Howard Roark is very close to Mallory in the spirit, as everybody else, all the positive characters are, but Mallory kind of isolates the spirit part far more than anybody else. And Tui he's the destroyer. He's the exact opposite of that. I think that this is a battle between Plato and Aristotle. This loop, the outer loop, is the Aristotelian loop. And this inner loop is the Platonic loop. So you can take the same ideas, and just like it has happened in philosophy, and Marxists are just one part of the loop, who say the goods are here, the physical goods are here, so who cares about the spirit? And you're right, fundamentally, Ellsworth Toohey is not a Marxist in that sense, because he is saying that spirit is important and it needs to be killed. So he's saying something about the spirit. Marxists are simply saying goods are here on the these people have created goods in the world. That's it. Forget about the spirit now. But I want to say 2 things about the spirit. When you look at, Bhagavad Gita, it is very clear. It is, you're seeking the highest possible. That is the Jnana Yoga. You're trying to learn. You're doing your mission. You're doing the right things in the world to build it. And then you have the love. That's the loop. So what I have found, thanks to my study of Gospel of John, especially by Aquinas. See, Aquinas is not Ellsworth Toohey, is no Ellsworth Toohey. Aquinas is Aristotelian. So there is a Aristotelian view of religion, just like there is a Platonic view. Unfortunately, just like modern philosophy, most of it is Plato. Plato has won. It is all Platonic, with just minor traces of Aristotelian left. I think the same is true with religion. And when you apply Platonism to religion, it does the same thing. What it does is that it takes the highest ideas and turns it into rituals. And you basically use all of the grandeur that the religion has created in order to destroy the soul of people. So they are full of fear, and then they are exploited. So that loop, the Platonic loop, is not any different than what goes on in universities, the humanities department, in philosophy. So it is Plato versus these two loops. This is the Aristotelian loop, and this is the Platonic loop. Plato has really amazing things to talk about on the highest possible. He spends a lot of time talking about it, but the effect of talking about it is to kill the spirit because it is dissociated from it. So in that sense, he belongs to this loop. He is focused on killing this part. That's how I understand it. Let me go ahead and now focus. Let's go ahead and open it up for any comments, folks. Just general comments on this entire meetup. It's been amazing. It's been very long, but I think we have covered so much. It's one of my favorite meetups on this. So give me just a second. I'm going to allow people to unmute. So we're going to start with Houheneka, Joe, and Jack. And folks, give your detailed comments. We really want to know. I really want to know what you guys think. So Houheneka, Joe, and Jack. Houheneka.
First of all, I want to thank all of the presenters. Maritza's really moved me to the point where I had to go off camera. So I'm going to try not to cry, but I think the most impactful of that was the idea of loving yourself. And I thought about that because I'm like, well, how do you know love if you can't love yourself? And for me, why it's so emotional is because I was kind of taught the opposite through religion, is that you're supposed to think of other people better than yourself. And so I never looked at it from the aspect of, if I love myself, then I can love other people. I couldn't truly love other people if you don't love yourself. So that was the most impactful. I mean, and everybody had great things. This is just my opinion. I'm not saying anybody else's was better or worse. Trust me, I'm not. But for me, that really got that. And I think Howard work is the epitome of that. But I think the opposite is Peter Keating and Katie, which is why Peter Keating and Katie would never work. Neither one of them loved themselves. And Peter Keating was the type, and I know a lot of Peter Keatings because I worked in insurance. They live for other people and they don't know what that is. And they're raised to not know what that is. I mean, a lot of people are raised to not know what it's like to truly love oneself. And not in like, because it sounds selfish, right? It almost sounds like you're putting everybody else second to you. But when you love yourself, you will love other people. And I think that's the key right there, is that you will love other people when you love yourself. So I love that. I love how Rourke saw in Dominique that Dominique wasn't there yet. And that he recognized that he was going to wait years. Like, that's got to be torture for him, to have to wait years for this person to get ready. And it's always the phrase that I remember that, like, I don't know if it's just in the Black community, but it might be in all different ways. But in Black people, they say, what is for you will come to you. Like, you don't have to force it. You don't have to control it. And that leads, like, you don't have to force it. You don't have to control it. If it's meant for you, it'll come to you. And so, I think that's a poignant point in going to Ellsworth Toohey. The thing about Ellsworth Toohey is that he's trying to control others because he was bullied as a kid. He was a young kid who had, developmental issues, and people thought to pick on him. So first, it was a self-defense move, right? Like, if I can control the situation, people can't touch me. And I get that on a very deep level. I think what happened to Ellsworth Toohey is that he started taking joy in controlling other people. But what he doesn't realize, I think, at least, I mean, I haven't read the whole book, obviously, so I could be wrong down the road. But what he doesn't realize is that when he's trying to control others and to take other souls, that he's destroying his own self, because he doesn't love himself as well. He's also, taking his own niece's soul, his, people who are looking to him for help. He is taking advantage of, in a sense, and is controlling them. And like, when you try to control other people, ultimately that hurts you. Like, if we are all like together, like we were talking about it last night in the Gita meetup, if we are all connected, right? When you hurt someone else, you're ultimately hurting yourself. When you're trying to destroy someone else, you are ultimately destroying yourself, because you are all connected. And so I truly believe that. So this was really a very good meetup. Thank you guys. I saw everyone's heart come out in this in different ways. So thank you for sharing yourselves today in this meetup. I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was wonderful. And there's a lot more to unpack, but thank you.
Thank you, Evanik. And please feel free to, I do think that Maritza just was, just over the top this time. And it's okay to say that. That's fantastic. So that's great. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Jack. Joe.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, all the panelists have been, they've been excellent throughout the series. I mean, it's really been, and it's amazing if you go through enough panelists, somebody's going to hit on what you were thinking. And for me, it was actually Joia, when specifically this idea that where Rourke says, "I don't think of you," and just how incredibly powerful that actually is. Because if you think about it, the whole entire time is that essentially, as Evanik has just beautifully said, that Ellsworth Toohey is seeking control, and he's seeking control in others. And so and Rob put it beautifully as well, it's the collection of souls. And he's actually bringing out the worst in everyone else by doing that. Everybody's acting against their own personal belief systems, or even they lose their ability to actually behave morally in that process, so that they can't even follow their own moral compass. And I think that that's really kind of what the story is with some of these, and what Ayn Rand, and essentially Rob actually got to this a couple weeks ago when he mentioned to me, and I said, I don't mean to bring up religion in Ayn Rand, but he then corrected me, and he said, he said it is like, essentially she's trying to supplant a religion in a way, the religion of, dogma, but I'd say it's more dogma than anything else. And actually, Shrikant, what you said, this idea that Rourke is here to transform the world. He is the ideal, right? So that he's reminding people that you can be yourself. You can be an individual. And that one line where Dominique says, what if we're wrong about the world? That's very powerful, because what it is it starts to become something where now this is where you start to say, what else is possible? And it kind of breaks away from the collective wisdom. And this example of architecture that Sherri had brought along, I thought was very interesting as well, how people were living and then how the church was actually structured. And that when you were walked in, you felt like it was this transformative experience. But that's a form. That's not what it really is. And this battle actually still goes on today. very much so, with traditionalists and people that are hanging on to the forms of the churches, and individuals that are designing new churches. And traditionalists want, obviously the more, grand and historical type of architectures, which can't be replicated, and there is a role for them. I don't mean to say there isn't, but there's something else there. It's the grandeur that when you walk in, and that you kind of feel almost inferior. And you can even see this playing out, and because I was raised Catholic, I understand these things, is that just the way the Mass itself was being structured at one point before Vatican I, the priest would keep his face to the east, well, to the, away from everyone. And essentially there was this distance between you and the hierarchy of the church. And then Vatican II kind of changed all that. And there was even the Latin Mass, there was all those other things that had come into place. But what I'm saying in that is that that's interesting, because then you have this hierarchical structure that is kind of controlling, versus actually maybe necessarily kind of looking at it from a more of a individualistic point of view. So that there's this way these forms play out in the real world. It's very interesting in sense that when religions become kind of dogmas, they become controlling, and that's kind of what Tui's doing in a way. He's actually, regardless, he's found himself. Now he's trying to collect souls, just like a religion would, that would have a dogmatic religion, I'll just say, for that. And I think that that's a really important point. So here's the other hero that you have, the savior, which is Rourke. And it's not totally dissimilar to a Christ figure, in the sense that, the way Christ has come along and essentially said, you're hanging on to the forms, you're hanging on to the structures, you're hanging on. This is what religion's really all about. And he upends essentially conventional wisdom at that particular moment in time, that religion is for everyone, that God is for everyone, that he's here for everyone. So it was the religious aspect of it is something that I find to be especially interesting in this particular instance, because it's kind of creating a whole new way of viewing yourself, but not necessarily discarding the religious aspects of it altogether. And that's an important thing to consider. So that was I thought that was they were all excellent presentations, and yeah, thank you again.
Excellent, thank you. I just want to comment on one point about what you said about the religion. I mean, the simplest way of looking at it is that Ayn Rand focuses on the human spirit. That is the core of her focus. And that is the core of the focus of all original, that's the original focus of all the religions, of human spirit. And then there is all kinds of stuff that comes from it. There is the doctrine, there is the institutions and rituals and all of it. And many times those things overwhelm the focus on the human spirit. And in the modern world is materialistic. It has not really focused. It doesn't focus explicitly on the human spirit. It just deals with it sometimes. So in that sense, Ayn Rand is in the tradition of saying human spirit is the driving force. Focus on that. And in that, it is similar to what Joia was saying, that's Ayn Rand's religion. Simple. It's if she focuses on the spiritual axis, that's what she focuses on. So wonderfully put. Next up is Jack.
Yeah, hi. So this is my second time going through the book. The first time was over the holidays, and just this past holidays, and I'm really enjoying this series. And I'm every time I come here, each weekend, I'm learning more and more, and I really appreciate everyone's time in preparing these talks. as the talks are going on, I'm flipping through my book, jotting down notes, attaching bookmarks to the pages and stuff. So I really appreciate these. I just is it okay for me to ask a question?
Please go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So the part that Joia brought up about the swamp. So this is like at the time when Ellsworth and Dominique are forming the alliance, or stating that they're going to be allies, and then Ellsworth Toohey kind of does the comparison between the two possible attitudes to take, the whole idea of the city being built, and then the swamp, the cave next to the swamp. So I'm wondering, why does Ayn Rand have Ellsworth Toohey frame his argument of being a true humanitarian as this preference of a cave by an oozing swamp, and and then having a fire of sticks rubbed together is preferable, and why not frame it in a way that the world seems, the worldview would be more justifiable or reasonable view? Or is it because Ayn Rand has Ellsworth Toohey feel that he's so comfortable being able to talk with Dominique that he can lower his guard and just say that, in fact, he just wants the world to burn. So, I guess that's my question.
Wonderful. Thank you. Joia, would you like to answer?
Could you just repeat the question again?
Yeah. So, I mean, I understand that these are archetypes, some of these characters are archetypes, right? So, and I'm just wondering, why did Ayn Rand kind of present Ellsworth Toohey by having this discussion, essentially saying that he would prefer, he's basically saying he'd prefer this cave by an oozing swamp, the fire of sticks rubbed together is preferable, and being a true humanitarian, as opposed to, perhaps a more realist, in a more realistic story, or in a more realistic sense, framing his, his preference in a way that seems more justifiable or reasonable worldview. Or is it because, Ayn Rand's just, she's basically kind of framing it in a way that Ellsworth Toohey is so comfortable being able to talk with Dominique, having an honest discussion of what he really feels. He doesn't have to put up, the presentation that he made with others, that he can just say he just wants the world to burn. And it's not about presenting a worldview or whatever. That's just ultimately his goal.
Yeah, and so I think here, we do see that because Toohey and Dominique, to a certain extent, understand each other, because, so to use Shrikant's language, they both see this vertical access. That's something that they both share, and they have two different approaches to it, because Toohey sees it and wants to destroy it, and Dominique sees it and is really conflicted about it, because she simultaneously loves it but doesn't think it's going to survive, so she's going against it. And so, to the extent that she's going against it, they can be allies, and they do share this common understanding. So I think that that's part of what we're seeing here, and Toohey's putting his guard down. But just getting back to the two attitudes towards humanity, and this kind of idea what is it to be a humanitarian? It gets to this question of what is it to be a human? And so the point here, I think, is that Toohey and Dominique and Rourke, they see the vertical axis, and they see this is the human spirit. They see the function of the human spirit is to seek out the highest possible, and then I guess to take Shrikant's analogy, to kind of go through the spiral of the whole triangle. That is what humanity is all about. And then they look at the world around them and say, most people are not even aware of this. They're not even doing that. So then there's the question. So is humanity humans at their highest potential and reaching through the circle, or is humanity just the bulk of what we see everybody else doing? And so Toohey's going to say, well, to be the real humanitarian is to just kind of be with the bulk of everyone else, where it's just the cave and the swamp and the sticks, and there's no even conception of reaching toward the highest possible, as opposed to the view of that the real humanitarian is the one who does see the highest possible and is trying to lift everyone toward reaching toward their highest vision of human potential.
Thank you, Joia. What I would say is that Dominique is a very unusual character. Everybody is speaking things directly to her because she is so honest. And so you would see Gail Winan, Peter Keating, and Ellsworth Toohey talking to her directly, saying things to her that they would never say. Ellsworth Toohey would never say this to anybody else. His entire life is based on lying to people. They can't do anything. So it is only in this context. And the reason she says it to Dominique, firstly, it's like, that's what he is. And he can't talk about that to anybody. Secondly, he can talk about it to Dominique because she agrees that the world deserves what he is doing to it. You know, basically he's destroying the world. He's destroying the spirit of people. And she actually says that, look, this vertical axis is so important that we should keep the world away from it. So they have tactically the same tactics. Their strategy or their vision of what they want is completely exactly opposite, but their tactics at that time are together. It's a rare opportunity for Ellsworth to actually speak to another human being, and he has some amount of human being in him. That's why he talks to Dominique. Next up is Maritza.
Yeah, on this topic, I want to throw in just a little bit of spoilers. Towards the end of the book, there's a conversation between Tui and Keating that is right along the lines of, you know, what Jack has pinpointed in his question, the idea of, you know, why is Tui feeling this way? So, you know, Tui's ultimate thing is power. Remember, he's trying to collect souls. And he has a conversation with Keating towards the end, which is fascinating. And he's describing this, you know, he says, you know, he says, like he's telling him, we want to know how it's done. He goes, you kill a man's aspiration and his integrity. And he says, what you can do is if you take away their will, or, you know, he's trying to kill the soul, right? And he says, since the supreme ideal is behind his grasp, he gives up eventually all ideals. And so what we see here is what Tui's about is he's trying to kill the ideal. He's trying to kill other works in the world. He doesn't want to kill them. He wants to kill how others view them and make sure that none future of them respond. So he thinks he sees in Dominique a similar minded soul. And it's interesting to see their interactions because she allies herself with him for reasons very differently from what he believes are her reasons. And I find that to be a little bit fascinating by him because she's his biggest miscalculation. And we'll see him learning that as we go through the book. And so their interaction is kind of vital to seeing her growth. Well, actually, and technically Tui's growth as well, because they are working along the same line, but the basis is so different. And I think that that's interesting because it shines a spotlight on how you can seem to be coming from one point when you're actually not. So that's all I'm going to say about that, but I just wanted to point that out.
Wonderful. I just want to tell that I have this very interesting table, which I'm not going to talk about today, of basically Stephen Mallory, Dominique Francon, and you know what, let me just show it to you, and then I can just, I can't resist doing this. I'll be very quick.
Didn't you share this with us in the last meetup?
No, I've developed it quite a bit.
Okay.
So I'll be very quick. Let me see here. Oh, just a second. It didn't share. Okay, share screen share, start broadcast. Okay, there it is. Now I go to this. Okay, so here, okay, so the important things previously I talked about it in terms of the strengths. Now I'm talking about it. I'm saying what I noticed is that all characters are actually moving along this triangle. So in that loop, all of them are moving. They're just starting with different places. So this is Stephen Mallory. He's starting with seeking the highest. And then he builds sculptures, and he's weakest. This is the weakest part that he has of love. That's why he has the fear of the beast. Okay, so you can see the strengths and the weaknesses here. You can see Dominique Francon. The strongest part she has is she actually loves the center. She has understanding, and she actually, so this one is weakest. This one, she doesn't want to build in the world. She doesn't think it should be, you should build in the world. Okay, she's trying to actually destroy people, you know, Howard Roark's ability to build. Mike, yeah, I don't have his last name, so I'm putting Mike. He is the greatest at building. He loves the center to some extent, but he's not really conceptual. You know, he tries to stay away from all architects, all concepts, until he discovers Howard Roark. So you can see that there is strengths and weaknesses over here. On the other side, you can see that what Ellsworth Toohey specializes in is destruction of truth, destruction of the highest, and thereby destroying the spirit. So he's an intellectual who is going to destroy the truth. Mike Donegan, okay, MD, very good. So that's what he's doing. In case of Peter Keating, he's filled with fear of the center. That's his core thing. This is new, this part here. Gail Winan, the first thing he's doing is that he's exploiting the fear of the people. That's how he's operating. So he's exploiting the fear of the people. Then he's creating creating falsehoods in the banner, which is going to create more fear. So that's what he's doing. What Ellsworth Toohey is doing is that he's destroying spirits of people, their ability to think, ability to conceptualize, going to cause fear, and then collect some reward. This is least important part. This is least important part. So this is where they start. Similarly, Peter Keating is going to be full of fear. He's going to exploit people. That's a second thing. And then destruction, he's not doing that much destruction. So you can see that there is, and it's again in the same order. So that's what I wanted to point out, that it's not just strengths and weaknesses. It's all happening in the, along the loops. All the movements are along the loops. That's all I wanted to point out. Folks, this has been just an incredible meetup. You know, what Rob did, what Sherri did, you know, what Maritza did, what Rupali did, what Joia did, what Iris did. It was just magnificent. And I don't know whether the cause of it is that we are trying to do too much, but I promise you next time we're not going to try to do too much. Next part 3 has only about 9 sections. So we will divide it into 2. Either it will be 4 or 5. 1 to 4 next time or 1 to 5 next time. That one, let me just look and confirm. I'll put it on the Meetup page, but you can prepare for that. It'll give us a little bit of break. And I just love this. You know, this is just so incredible. Thank you very much, everybody. Great comments, Evanique, Joe, and Jack. Really appreciate that. See you. We have a meetup tonight at 9 o'clock on Bhagavad Gita, where I will be doing another live translation of Nyaneshwari, and Yogeshwar will be talking about the topic. It's really, really fascinating. So anyway, this is great. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.